Welcome, kind listener, to this peaceful haven of history. This is a place where stories flow like a gentle river, carrying us far away from the rush of the present. Whether you are lying in bed, eyes growing heavy, or sitting quietly as the evening settles, know that you are among friends here. If you'd like, share in the comments where you are listening from. I treasure the chance to see how history brings together people from every corner of the world. And if these calm journeys speak to you, go ahead and subscribe, so our paths may cross again in the chapters to come. But for now, let the noise of today drift away, and join me as we wander softly into the mists of the past. Close your eyes for just a moment and imagine with me. Picture an island emerging from the gray waters of the North Sea, wrapped in morning fog, its chalk cliffs rising white against the endless blue. This is Britain, not as we know it today with its motorways and cities of glass and steel, but Britain as it was 1500 years ago, when the Romans were packing their belongings and preparing to leave, when the great stone roads they had built were beginning to crack with neglect, when the world was balanced between what had been and what was yet to come. The year is somewhere around 410, give or take a handful of seasons. Time moved differently then, measured not in precise calendar dates but in harvests and kings' reigns, in the memories of grandmothers who could still recall when their own grandmothers were young. The Roman Empire, that vast machinery of law and legion, of aqueduct and amphitheater, was crumbling at its edges like an old manuscript left too long in the rain. Across the Channel, Rome itself faced threats that seemed unimaginable just a generation before. Gothic armies pressed at the gates. The frontiers, once so firmly held, were collapsing like a dam giving way to an unstoppable flood. And so the legions withdrew from Britain. Not all at once, not in a single dramatic moment, but gradually, like a tide pulling back from the shore. First one garrison was recalled, then another. The soldiers marched south to the ports, their armor clinking in the misty dawn, their faces turned toward a homeland that many of them had never seen. They left behind stone forts with their walls still strong, bath houses where the heating systems would soon grow cold, villas with their mosaic floors depicting gods and heroes who would soon be forgotten by the people who swept those floors. The Britons who remained, those Celtic people who had lived under Roman rule for nearly 4 centuries, found themselves suddenly alone, like children whose parents have left them to fend for themselves in a darkening wood. They had grown accustomed to Roman protection, Roman organization, Roman certainty. The roads that connected every town, the coins that made trade simple, the laws that settled disputes, the soldiers who kept the raiders at bay, all of this was the framework of their lives. And now that framework was being dismantled, piece by piece, year by year. Imagine a villa in what we now call the Cotswolds, its stones honey-colored in the afternoon sun. The master of this villa stands in his courtyard, watching his servants tend the garden that his grandfather planted. He wears a toga in the old Roman fashion, though his Latin is mixed with British words, though his children speak less Latin than he does, though he knows in his heart that the old ways are slipping through his fingers like water through a broken cup. He receives fewer letters from the continent now. The merchants who used to bring wine and olive oil and news from distant cities come less frequently. The roads are less safe than they once were. In the towns, places like Londinium, Eboracum, Corinium, life continues with a kind of determined normalcy. Markets still gather, though there are fewer goods to sell. Churches still hold services, for Christianity has taken root deeply in these islands during the last century of Roman rule. Bishops still guide their flocks, still debate fine points of theology, still write letters to their counterparts across the water. But the stone buildings require maintenance that no one quite knows how to provide. The public baths close, one by one, because the complex hypocaust systems that heated them are breaking down and there are no engineers left who understand how to repair them. And beyond the old Roman frontiers, beyond Hadrian's wall with its gray stones stretching across the neck of the island, other peoples are stirring. The Picts in the north, whom the Romans never fully conquered, grow bolder. They raid southward, taking cattle and slaves, burning farms that had known peace for generations. From Ireland come the Scoti, fierce warriors in their small leather boats, landing on western shores to plunder and sometimes to settle. And from across the North Sea, from the misty coastlands of what we now call Germany and Denmark and the Netherlands, come rumors of other peoples, other warriors, other migrations beginning. But let us not rush forward. Let us linger here a while in this twilight world, this Britain caught between empire and chaos, between order and uncertainty. Because it is in these quiet, uncertain years that the seeds are planted for everything that follows. In these years, the Britons must learn to be themselves again, to remember the ways their great-great-grandparents knew before the Romans came. They must remember how to defend their own borders, how to settle their own disputes, how to organize their own society without the structure of empire to guide them. Some Britons rise to this challenge magnificently. Local leaders, men of wealth and influence in their communities, begin to take on the responsibilities that Roman officials once held. They organize militias, they fortify old hill forts that haven't been used for military purposes in 300 years, they forge alliances with neighboring territories. In some places, small kingdoms begin to emerge, ruled by men who claim descent from ancient British royal lines, who perhaps exaggerate their connections to the dim legendary past to justify their present power. One name that echoes down through the mist of these years is Vortigern. Whether he was a single historical figure or a title used by several leaders or a legend grown from smaller truths, we cannot say with certainty. But the stories tell us that Vortigern was a British king, or high king, or perhaps simply the most powerful of the British leaders in the years after Rome departed. And the stories tell us that Vortigern, faced with raids from the Picts and Scoti, made a decision that seemed reasonable at the time but would change the course of history forever. He invited warriors from across the sea to come and help defend Britain. He offered them land and provisions in exchange for their military service. These warriors were Saxons, or so the chroniclers called them, though they came from several different Germanic peoples, Angles from the coastal regions, Saxons from further south, Jutes from the Danish peninsula. They were skilled fighters, these men, accustomed to the sea and to warfare, pagan in their beliefs, seeking new lands as their own territories grew crowded or as their leaders grew ambitious. The story is told that 3 ships arrived first, carrying 2 brothers named Hengist and Horsa. Again, we move in the realm where history and legend blur together, where the names might be symbolic rather than individual. Hengist means stallion and Horsa means horse in their language, suggesting perhaps that these were totemic names rather than the actual names their mothers called them. But the ships are real enough, and the men who sailed in them are real enough, even if we cannot now separate fact from myth in every detail. These first Saxon warriors fought well for Vortigern. They defeated the Picts who had been troubling the northern borders. They proved their value as allies. And so more ships came, and more warriors, and with them came families, women, and children seeking new homes in this green and gentle land. They settled in the eastern parts of the island, in what would become Kent and East Anglia, in the river valleys where the land was fertile and the sea was near. But the arrangement that had seemed so practical to Vortigern began to show its flaws. These Saxon warriors were not mercenaries content to serve and then depart. They were settlers, colonists, men with ambitions of their own. As their numbers grew, they became less willing to take orders from British kings. Disputes arose over payment, over land grants, over authority. And eventually, the inevitable happened. The Saxons turned from allies into invaders, from defenders of Britain into conquerors of Britain. The wars that followed were bitter and long. We hear of them only in fragments, in Welsh poems copied centuries later, in Latin chronicles written by monks who were themselves removed by generations from the events they described. The Britons fought desperately to hold their lands, to preserve their way of life, to keep alive the Christian civilization that Rome had brought them. And for a time, in some places, they succeeded magnificently. Here the mists part briefly and we catch a glimpse of a name that will echo through all the centuries to come: Arthur. Was there a historical Arthur? A British war leader who won great victories against the Saxon invaders in the late 5th or early 6th century? Perhaps. The earliest mentions of Arthur appear in Welsh sources from centuries later, but they speak of him with such confidence, such assumption that their listeners will know who he was, that many historians believe there must have been some original figure behind the legend. The stories tell us of 12 battles that Arthur fought, culminating in a great victory at a place called Mount Badon, where the Saxons were so thoroughly defeated that they ceased their expansion for a generation. Picture, if you will, a hilltop somewhere in southern Britain. We no longer know exactly where, though many places claim the honor. Dawn is breaking over fields that have been trampled by armies, over earthworks hastily thrown up by desperate defenders. The British warriors stand behind their shields, weary from days of fighting but determined not to yield another inch of their homeland. Arthur rides among them, not the shining knight of medieval romance, not the king of Camelot with his round table and his court of chivalry, but a war leader in whatever rough armor he could forge or salvage, carrying a sword that was precious because good iron was precious, riding a horse that was valued beyond gold because cavalry gave the Britons an advantage over the Saxon foot soldiers. He speaks to his men in their own Celtic tongue, reminds them of their ancestors and their honor, invokes Christ and the saints to aid their cause. And when the Saxons advance up the hill, confident in their numbers and their battle fury, the British line holds, and then counterattacks, and the day is won. Or so the story goes. What we know with more certainty is that Saxon expansion into Britain was indeed halted for several decades around the turn of the 6th century. Something happened, someone led the Britons to victory significant enough to give them breathing space, to preserve British kingdoms in the west and north for another century and more. Whether that someone was named Arthur or something else, whether he was a king or a general or a chieftain, matters less than the fact that the defense succeeded, at least for a time. But history is patient and relentless. The Saxons, though checked, were not defeated. They held the lands they had already taken, consolidated their settlements, grew crops, and raised children who were born on British soil and knew no other homeland. They gradually adopted Christianity from the Britons they lived alongside, though they kept their Germanic language and many of their customs. And slowly, inexorably, they began to expand again. By the middle of the 6th century, the map of Britain was a patchwork of kingdoms, some British, some Saxon. In the west and north, British kingdoms survived: Gwynedd in the mountains of Wales, Dumnonia in the southwest, Rheged in the northwest, Strathclyde in the far north. These kingdoms preserved the Romano-British Christian culture, continued to write in Latin, maintained connections with the Christian communities in Ireland and Brittany and Gaul. Their poets sang in Old Welsh, celebrating their heroes and lamenting their losses in verses that survive to this day as some of the earliest literature of the British Isles. One such poem, the Gododin, tells of a band of 300 warriors who rode south from what is now Edinburgh to fight the Angles at a place called Catrith. They feasted for a year before their departure, we are told, drinking mead and listening to songs, preparing themselves for the glory and the death they knew awaited them. Then they rode to battle, and of those 300, only 3 survived to tell the tale. The poem remembers each man, speaks his name with honor, ensures that his courage will not be forgotten even though his cause was lost. In the east and south, Saxon kingdoms grew and multiplied. Kent, under the descendants of Hengist or whoever those first Saxon leaders truly were, became a sophisticated realm, trading with Frankish kingdoms across the Channel, producing fine jewelry and metalwork. Essex, the kingdom of the East Saxons, controlled the lands around the Thames estuary. Sussex, the South Saxons, held the coast. Wessex, the West Saxons, expanded gradually into what had been British territory. East Anglia, land of the Angles, grew wealthy from trade and agriculture. Northumbria, formed from the union of 2 smaller kingdoms, stretched from the Humber to the Forth, a vast domain that would become perhaps the most powerful of all the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. And in the middle, in the heart of what would become England, lay Mercia, whose name means the border people, for they lived between the British West and the Saxon East, learning from both, fighting with both, gradually becoming the kingdom that would dominate the center of the island for centuries. These kingdoms were not like modern nation-states with clear borders and centralized governments. They were more fluid, more personal. A kingdom was wherever a king could enforce his will, wherever warriors acknowledged his authority, wherever farmers paid him tribute. Borders shifted with every war, every alliance, every royal marriage. A strong king might rule over several smaller kingdoms whose own kings became his subordinates. A weak king might find his realm divided among his sons after his death, each portion becoming an independent kingdom once again. But gradually, through war and marriage and negotiation, these many small kingdoms began to coalesce into larger units. By the 7th century, the pattern was becoming clearer. In the north, Northumbria was supreme, its kings ruling from the Forth to the Humber, patronizing monasteries where monks created manuscripts of breathtaking beauty, sending missionaries to convert their still pagan relatives on the continent. In the Midlands, Mercia grew in strength and ambition under a series of capable kings. In the south, Wessex consolidated its power while smaller kingdoms like Kent and Essex struggled to maintain their independence. Let us pause here and spend a moment imagining what life was like for ordinary people in these early medieval centuries. Because history so often focuses on kings and battles, on the great events that shape the course of nations, that we forget the daily rhythms of life that most people experienced, the small domestic scenes that made up the texture of their existence. Picture a village somewhere in the rolling hills of what will one day be called Wessex. It is spring, and the fields have just been plowed. The heavy wooden plow, pulled by oxen whose breath steams in the cool morning air, has turned the earth in long furrows. Men and women walk behind, casting seeds by hand, the ancient rhythm of sowing that has changed little since their ancestors first learned agriculture thousands of years before. The village itself is a cluster of wooden buildings with thatched roofs, surrounded by a wooden palisade that offers some protection against raiders or wild animals. The King's Hall stands at the center, larger than the other buildings, its doorway carved with intricate patterns that would once have been painted in bright colors. Inside, the hall is dim and smoky, warmed by a long fire pit running down its center. This is where the village gathers for feasts, where the Lord dispenses justice, where travelers are offered hospitality as ancient custom demands. Around the hall stand smaller buildings, the houses of farmers and craftsmen, barns for animals, storage buildings for grain and tools. Each house is a single room, dark and smoky like the hall, with a fire for cooking and warmth, benches, and sleeping platforms around the walls. Few possessions because most people owned little more than the clothes on their backs, some cooking pots, perhaps a chest for storing their best garments and small treasures. The people who live here are free farmers, ceorls in their own language, men who own their land and owe service to their lord but are not slaves. They rise with the sun and work until darkness falls. Their lives are shaped by the seasons, spring for plowing and sowing, summer for tending crops and animals, autumn for harvest and slaughter, winter for staying warm and surviving until spring comes again. They mark time not by dates but by saints' days and festivals, by the cycles of moon and sun, by the ages of their children and the years of their king's reign. They eat simple food, much simpler than we can easily imagine. Bread made from whatever grain they grow, barley, oats, rye, or if they are fortunate, wheat. Porridge or gruel for breakfast, eaten from wooden bowls with wooden spoons. Cheese and butter in summer when the cows give milk abundantly. Eggs from chickens scratching in the yard. Meat only occasionally, usually pork from a pig slaughtered in autumn, preserved with salt for the winter months. Vegetables from their gardens, onions, leeks, turnips, peas, beans, cabbage. Apples and pears from their orchards. Honey, the only sweetness they know, gathered from wild bees or from hives kept near the village. They drink ale, because water is often unsafe and ale, even weak ale, is safer. Even children drink ale, a thin, barely fermented brew that would hardly deserve the name by modern standards. Wine is only for the wealthy, imported from Francia or made from the grapes that grow in the warmer southern parts of the island. Their clothes are wool in winter, linen in summer, both spun and woven by the women of the household. Natural colors mostly, the gray and brown and cream of undyed wool and linen, because dyes are expensive, though festive garments might be colored with plant dyes, yellow from weld, red from madder, blue from woad. The men wear tunics reaching to the knee, with leggings bound with cloth strips for warmth. The women wear long dresses with an overdress or apron, their hair covered by a cloth once they are married. Both sexes wear cloaks fastened with brooches for warmth and protection from the rain. They are Christian, these villagers, at least nominally. The old pagan gods of their Saxon ancestors, Woden, Thunor, Frigg, are fading into memory, surviving mainly in the names of days and in half-remembered charms. A wooden church stands at the edge of the village, and a priest comes regularly to say Mass, to baptize babies, to bury the dead. But Christianity has not entirely displaced the older beliefs, the sense that the world is full of spirits, that certain trees and wells and stones are sacred, that charms and amulets can protect against illness and misfortune. They are largely illiterate, these farmers and craftsmen, but they are not ignorant. They possess vast stores of practical knowledge about farming and animal husbandry, about the weather and the stars, about metalworking and woodworking and textile production. They know hundreds of songs and stories, preserved through memory and recitation, entertainment for long winter evenings when darkness comes early and there is little to do but sit by the fire and talk and sing. They know their genealogies going back generations, can recite their descent from ancestors real and mythical, can tell you which of their neighbors are kin and which are strangers. Their lives are short by modern standards. Many children die before they reach their 5th year, carried off by diseases we can now prevent with simple vaccines. Women die in childbirth with tragic frequency. Men die from accidents while farming or hunting, from infections that we would cure with antibiotics, from violence when disputes escalate into blood feuds. If you survive childhood and avoid accidents and violence in childbirth, you might live to see your grandchildren, but few people live past 50, and those who do are honored as repositories of memory and wisdom. And yet there is joy in these lives too, not despite their hardship but woven through it. The satisfaction of a good harvest safely gathered. The warmth of the hall on a winter night when snow lies deep outside. The laughter of children playing by the river. The songs of summer festivals. The pride of a craftsman in a piece well made. The love between husband and wife, between parent and child, between friends who have known each other since childhood. Now let us shift our gaze upward, from the village to the kingdom, from the farmer to the king. Because while ordinary people lived their quiet lives, plowing and sowing and harvesting, kings and their warriors were shaping the political landscape through war and alliance, through ambition and strategy, through triumph and disaster. In the year 604, a baby was born into the royal family of Northumbria who would grow up to become one of the most remarkable kings of the early medieval period. His name was Oswald, and though he spent his childhood in exile, driven from his kingdom by a rival king who murdered his father, he would return to reclaim his throne and transform Northumbria into the greatest kingdom in Britain. But before we can tell Oswald's story properly, we must speak of the transformation that was sweeping through the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms in these decades, the conversion to Christianity. For the Saxons who had invaded Britain had been pagans, worshippers of the same Germanic gods their ancestors had honored. And though they lived among Christian Britons, though they sometimes married British wives who were Christian, their own conversion came slowly and through other channels. In the year 597, Pope Gregory the Great in Rome looked northward toward the islands at the edge of the world and thought of the pagan Saxons who lived there. he sent a mission led by a monk named Augustine, not the famous Augustine who wrote the Confessions and City of God. That Augustine had been dead for more than a century, but another Augustine, a man of gentler temperament perhaps, a man willing to travel to the edge of civilization to bring the Christian faith to barbarian kings. Augustine and his companions landed in Kent, where King Ethelbert ruled. Ethelbert's wife was Bertha, a Christian Frankish princess, and she had already prepared the ground for the mission. The king received Augustine with cautious respect, listened to his preaching, and eventually converted, opening the way for his people to follow. Augustine became the first Archbishop of Canterbury, establishing the foundation for what would become the center of English Christianity for all the centuries to follow. From Kent, Christianity spread to the other Saxon kingdoms. Sometimes the spread was peaceful, the result of missionary work and royal example. Sometimes it was political, sealed by marriages between Christian and pagan royal families, by treaties that included religious conversion as a condition. Sometimes it was violent, as Christian kings conquered pagan ones and imposed the new faith on their subjects. But there was another stream of Christianity flowing into Anglo-Saxon England, one that came not from Rome but from Ireland. Irish Christianity had its own character, shaped by centuries of development in isolation from continental influence. Irish monasteries were centers of learning and artistry, producing illuminated manuscripts of stunning beauty, preserving classical texts that had been lost elsewhere in the chaos of Rome's fall, sending missionaries across northern Europe. One of these Irish missionaries was Aidan, and it was Aidan whom Oswald invited to Northumbria when he reclaimed his kingdom in 634. Oswald had spent his exile in the Irish kingdom of Dalriada in what is now Scotland, had been baptized there, had learned to love the Irish form of Christianity with its emphasis on monasticism and missionary work, its beautiful books and beautiful liturgy. When Oswald defeated his enemies and became king, he gave Aidan the island of Lindisfarne, off the Northumbrian coast, as the site for his monastery and bishopric. Lindisfarne, or Holy Island as it came to be called, would become one of the great centers of learning and artistry in early medieval Europe. There the Lindisfarne Gospels would be created, a manuscript so beautiful that people still travel across the world to see it, its pages glowing with intricate patterns of Celtic knotwork, its letters decorated with birds and beasts and abstract designs that seemed to dance across the page. Oswald himself was a warrior king who fought many battles to expand and defend his kingdom, but he was also remembered for his piety and generosity. One story tells of a time when Oswald was feasting in his hall with Aidan at his side. A servant came to tell the king that a crowd of poor people had gathered outside, begging for food. Oswald immediately ordered that the feast laid before him be carried out and distributed to the poor, and that the silver platter on which it had been served be broken up and distributed as well. Aidan was so moved by this act of charity that he took Oswald's right hand and said, "May this hand never perish." And according to legend, when Oswald was killed in battle years later, his hand was cut off and preserved as a relic, and remained uncorrupted for centuries. But piety did not protect Oswald from the violence of his age. In 642, he was killed in battle by Penda, the pagan king of Mercia, one of the most formidable warriors of his generation. Penda was that rare figure in this period, a pagan king who resisted Christianity even as it spread through all the kingdoms around him. He allied with British kingdoms against other Saxon kingdoms, showing that religious affiliation could matter more than ethnic identity in the complex politics of 7th century Britain. Penda's Mercia became the dominant power in Britain after Oswald's death, controlling or influencing most of the other Saxon kingdoms. But Penda's own death in 655, killed in battle by Oswald's brother Oswiu, marked a turning point. With Penda gone, the last great pagan king of the Anglo-Saxons was no more. His sons converted to Christianity, and Mercia, like all the other kingdoms, became part of Christendom. The conversion of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms to Christianity was not just a matter of changing which gods they worshipped. It brought with it literacy, because the Christian scriptures had to be read, and that meant teaching people to read and write. It brought with it connections to the wider world of Christendom, to Rome and Francia and the Mediterranean, bringing new ideas and new goods and new cultural influences. It brought with it monasteries, which became centers of learning and culture, preserving and copying ancient texts, creating new works of theology and history and poetry. One of those monasteries was at Jarrow in Northumbria, and there in the early 8th century lived a monk named Bede. If we know anything at all about the history of Anglo-Saxon England, it is largely because of Bede. He wrote a history called the Ecclesiastical History of the English People, tracing the story of the English from their pagan origins through their conversion to Christianity, recording the deeds of kings and saints, preserving stories that would otherwise have been lost. Bede was a humble monk who spent his entire life in Jarrow, who probably never traveled more than a few miles from the monastery where he took his vows as a boy. But through his books, through his correspondence with scholars across Europe, through his tireless work of reading and writing and teaching, he became one of the most learned men of his age. When he died in 735, his students wept and said that a light had gone out of the world. Bede's history gives us a window into the world of early medieval England, but it is a window shaped by his own perspective and purposes. He was writing religious history, focused on the spread of Christianity, interested in miracles and saints more than in politics and economics. He was a Northumbrian, and his history reflects a Northumbrian point of view, giving less attention to the southern kingdoms. And he was writing for an audience of educated clergy, assuming a level of knowledge that ordinary laypeople would not have possessed. But even with these limitations, Bede's work is invaluable. Through his pages, we meet the great figures of the conversion period: Augustine arriving in Kent, Aidan preaching in Northumbria, the abbess Hild presiding over the monastery at Whitby where men and women lived in separate houses but shared a spiritual community, the illiterate cowherd Cadman who received from God the gift of composing religious poetry in English, the first Christian poetry in what would become the English language. We also learn from Bede about the great controversy of his age, the conflict between Roman and Irish Christianity over how to calculate the date of Easter. This might seem like a trivial matter to us, a technical dispute over calendars, but for medieval Christians it was a question of fundamental importance. How could the Church be truly universal if different regions celebrated the resurrection of Christ on different days? How could unity be maintained if such a basic element of Christian practice varied from place to place? The conflict came to a head at the Synod of Whitby in 664, where representatives of both traditions debated before King Oswiu of Northumbria. The Irish party argued for their traditional calculation, based on methods that went back to their founding saints. The Roman party argued that the Church should follow the practice of Rome, where Peter and Paul had been martyred, which Christ had designated as the rock upon which his Church would be built. In the end, Oswiu decided for the Roman method, swayed by the argument that Peter held the keys to heaven and that it would be unwise to risk offending him. The decision had far-reaching consequences. It brought English Christianity more firmly into alignment with continental practice, strengthened ties with Rome, and gradually marginalized the Irish traditions that had shaped Northumbrian Christianity in its early decades. Many Irish monks, unable to accept the decision, returned to Ireland or to monasteries in Scotland where Irish practice continued. But the Synod also symbolized something larger: the integration of Anglo-Saxon England into the broader world of European Christendom. No longer isolated on their island, no longer merely fighting among themselves for local supremacy, the English kingdoms were becoming part of a larger story, participants in a civilization that stretched from Ireland to Jerusalem, from Scandinavia to North Africa. And that larger world was about to intrude on England in ways no one could have predicted. For in the far south, in the deserts of Arabia, a new religion had arisen. Islam, preached by the Prophet Muhammad, had united the Arab tribes and sent them exploding outward in conquest. By the early 8th century, Islamic armies had conquered the Persian Empire, taken Jerusalem and Alexandria and Damascus, swept across North Africa, and crossed into Spain. The Christian kingdoms of Europe found themselves facing a powerful new rival, one that would shape the next millennium of European history. But in England, protected by the sea, the immediate impact of Islam's rise was limited to disruptions in Mediterranean trade and a general sense that the world was changing in ways beyond their control. More immediate was the internal struggle for supremacy among the English kingdoms themselves. In the 8th century, Mercia under King Ethelbald and his successor Offa reached the height of its power. Offa, who ruled from 757 to 796, was the most powerful English king since the great Northumbrian rulers of the previous century. He styled himself King of the English, though his authority was acknowledged more readily in some places than others. Offa is remembered today primarily for the great earthwork that bears his name, Offa's Dyke, a massive ditch and embankment running along the border between Mercia and the Welsh kingdoms. Modern archaeologists debate its exact purpose. Was it a defensive fortification, a boundary marker, a way to control trade and movement between English and Welsh territories? Perhaps it served all these functions and more. But imagine the work required to build it, miles and miles of dike, stretching across hills and valleys, requiring thousands of workers with shovels and baskets, moving earth and cutting trees and building a rampart that still runs through the Welsh borderlands today. It was a project that demonstrated royal power, the ability to mobilize labor on a massive scale, to impose the king's will on the landscape itself. Offa also reformed the coinage, introducing a new penny that would remain the basis of English currency for centuries. He corresponded with Charlemagne, the great Frankish king who was busy uniting much of Western Europe under his rule and who would be crowned emperor by the Pope on Christmas Day in 800. Offa negotiated the marriage of his daughter to one of Charlemagne's sons, treating with the most powerful ruler in Europe as an equal, or nearly so. But Offa's death in 796 exposed the weakness beneath Mercia's apparent strength. His son survived him by only a few months, and the kingdom fell into civil war as rival factions struggled for control. Other kingdoms that had submitted to Offa's overlordship quickly reasserted their independence. Mercian supremacy, though it would be partially restored under later kings, would never again be as complete as it had been under Offa. And even as the English kingdoms squabbled among themselves, a new threat was gathering beyond the horizon. In 793, a fleet of ships appeared off the coast of Northumbria. They were long, low vessels with square sails, fast and maneuverable, perfect for crossing the North Sea. They carried warriors from Scandinavia, men the English would come to call Vikings, Danes, Norsemen, heathens, the terror from the north. The Vikings landed at Lindisfarne, that holy island where Aidan had founded his monastery a century and a half before. They sacked the monastery, killed the monks or took them as slaves, stole the precious objects from the church, burned the buildings. The Lindisfarne Gospels, that masterpiece of medieval art, survived only because someone had the presence of mind to grab it and flee. The attack on Lindisfarne shocked Christian Europe. Monasteries were supposed to be safe, protected by their sanctity, exempt from the violence that might afflict secular settlements. The thought that pagans would desecrate a holy place, murder men who had taken vows of peace, steal chalices from altars, it seemed like a sign of the end times, a portent of divine judgment. Alcuin, a Northumbrian scholar who was living at Charlemagne's court, wrote a letter to King Athelred of Northumbria expressing his horror. Never before has such terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race. The heathens poured out the blood of saints around the altar, and trampled on the bodies of saints in the temple of God, like dung in the streets. But Lindisfarne was only the beginning. In 794, Vikings attacked Jarrow, Bede's old monastery. They raided the coast of Wessex. They struck at monasteries in Ireland. These early raids were hit-and-run affairs, the Vikings arriving suddenly in their swift ships, taking what they could carry, and departing before any organized defense could be mounted. For decades, the raids continued with increasing frequency. The Vikings learned which monasteries were wealthy, which towns were poorly defended, which coasts could be approached safely. They developed a reputation for ferocity and cruelty that was partly deserved and partly the result of Christian outrage at pagan attacks on holy sites. They were certainly violent, but no more so than Christian warriors who fought each other in the endless wars between kingdoms. The difference was that the Vikings were pagans attacking Christians, outsiders attacking what had become a settled Christian civilization, and that made their violence seem worse, more threatening, more apocalyptic. The Vikings themselves saw things differently, of course. They were warriors from lands where raiding was an honorable activity, where a man proved his worth by his courage and success in battle, where taking plunder from wealthy neighbors was simply what ambitious young men did. The monasteries of England and Ireland were tempting targets precisely because they were wealthy and poorly defended, filled with gold and silver objects made for religious purposes but just as valuable when melted down into portable wealth. These early Viking raiders were not trying to conquer England. They were opportunistic, seeking quick profit with minimal risk. They would sail across the North Sea in summer when the weather was favorable, raid a few coastal settlements, and return home before winter storms made the crossing too dangerous. For the communities they attacked, these raids were devastating, but for England as a whole, they were manageable, terrible but not existential. That changed in 851. In that year, a Danish army wintered in England for the first time, staying on the Isle of Thanet in Kent through the cold months instead of returning to Scandinavia. It was a sign of changing intentions. Warriors who brought their ships to England and stayed through winter were not mere raiders. They were explorers, scouts, men looking for opportunities for permanent settlement. And the opportunities were abundant. The English kingdoms, weakened by internal disputes and unprepared for sustained military campaigns against mobile enemy forces, struggled to respond effectively to the Viking threat. The Danes could move quickly up rivers in their shallow draft ships, strike deep inland, and retreat before local forces could gather. They could attack one kingdom and retreat to another, playing the English kingdoms against each other, exploiting the lack of unity that had plagued Britain since the Romans left. In 865, everything changed again. A massive Danish army, larger than any Viking force that had yet come to England, arrived under the leadership of warriors whose names have echoed through history: Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan, and Ubba, said to be sons of the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok. Whether these were their real names, whether they were truly brothers, whether Ragnar Lothbrok was a historical figure or a legendary composite, we cannot say with certainty. But the army they led was real enough, and its impact on England would be profound and lasting. This was not a raiding party. This was an army of conquest, the Great Heathen Army as the English chronicles called it, and its purpose was not to take plunder and leave but to take land and stay. The Danes marched through Northumbria and captured York, the ancient Roman city that had been the seat of Northumbrian power. They deposed the Northumbrian king and installed a puppet ruler who would govern under Danish oversight. From Northumbria, the Great Heathen Army moved south into Mercia, then into East Anglia. In East Anglia, they captured King Edmund, and when he refused to renounce his Christian faith and rule as their subordinate, they killed him. The manner of his death became the stuff of legend. He was said to have been tied to a tree and shot full of arrows, then beheaded, in mockery of Christian martyrdom. Whether the details are accurate or not, Edmund became a saint, his cult spreading rapidly, his shrine becoming a place of pilgrimage. By 870, the Danes controlled most of northern and eastern England. They had destroyed 3 of the 4 major Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Northumbria, East Anglia, and Mercia were under Danish rule or had ceased to exist as independent entities. Only Wessex remained, and the Danes were preparing to attack it. Let us pause here and travel south and west to Wessex, to understand what made this kingdom different, what enabled it to survive when the other kingdoms fell. Wessex had not always been the most powerful English kingdom. During the 7th and 8th centuries, it had been overshadowed by Northumbria and Mercia. But Wessex had certain advantages. It was wealthy, with good agricultural land and access to trade routes. It had strong leadership, a succession of capable kings who had maintained internal stability and gradually expanded their territory. And in the moment of its greatest peril, Wessex was ruled by a king who would prove to be one of the most remarkable figures of the medieval period. His name was Alfred, and he was the youngest son of King Ethelwulf of Wessex. Alfred was not supposed to become king. He had 3 older brothers who stood before him in the line of succession. But his oldest brother Ethelbald died in 860, the second brother Ethelbert died in 865, and the third brother Athelred was killed fighting the Danes in 871. And so Alfred, at the age of 22, found himself king of the last independent English kingdom, facing an enemy that had conquered everyone else who had stood against them. The first years of Alfred's reign were desperate. The Danes attacked Wessex repeatedly, and Alfred could do little but fight defensive battles, trying to preserve what territory he could. In 878, the Danes launched a surprise winter attack, capturing the royal estate at Chippenham where Alfred had been staying. The king barely escaped with his life, fleeing into the marshes of Somerset with a small band of followers. This was Alfred's lowest point, the moment when his kingdom seemed lost and his own survival uncertain. Later legends would embroider this period with stories. The famous tale of Alfred burning the cakes while hiding in a peasant woman's cottage, lost in thought about how to save his kingdom. Whether that story is true or invented, it captures something essential about this moment: the king of Wessex reduced to a fugitive in his own kingdom, depending on the hospitality of his poorest subjects. But Alfred did not despair. From his refuge in the marshes of Athelney, he began organizing resistance. He sent out messengers to the thanes and ealdormen who had survived the Danish attack, calling them to gather their forces. He planned a counterattack, carefully choosing the moment when the Danes would be least prepared. In the spring of 878, Alfred emerged from the marshes at the head of an army drawn from Somerset, Wiltshire, and Hampshire. The men who came to his banner had thought their king was dead or fled, and the sight of him alive and defiant rallied them to one final effort. They marched to Edington and there fought a battle that would determine the fate of England. The Battle of Edington was fierce and long. The Danish shield wall was formidable, warriors standing shoulder to shoulder, their shields overlapping, their spears and axes ready to strike down anyone who approached. But Alfred's men fought with the desperation of people defending their last refuge, and they fought with renewed confidence now that their king had returned. The battle raged from dawn until late in the day, neither side yielding, both lines holding firm despite casualties that mounted with each passing hour. And then, finally, the Danish line began to waver. Whether from exhaustion or demoralization or simply the accumulation of losses, the shield wall broke. The Danes retreated, pursued by the Saxons who had found new energy in the moment of breakthrough. The Danes fell back to their fortress at Chippenham, and Alfred besieged them there, cutting off their supplies, waiting for hunger to do what battle had not quite accomplished. After 2 weeks, the Danish commander Guthrum sued for peace. Alfred's terms were surprisingly generous considering how close the Danes had come to destroying his kingdom. Guthrum would withdraw from Wessex, taking his army back to East Anglia. He would convert to Christianity, with Alfred standing as his godfather at baptism. And most significantly, a boundary would be established between Alfred's kingdom and the Danish territories, a line running from London northwest to Chester, dividing England into a Saxon west and south and a Danish north and east. This division created what would be known as the Danelaw, the region where Danish law and custom prevailed, where Danish settlers lived alongside English inhabitants, where Norse and English mingled to create a hybrid culture. The Danelaw would shape the development of England for generations to come, influencing language and law and custom in ways that are still visible today if you know where to look. But Alfred was not content merely to have survived. Having saved his kingdom from conquest, he set about ensuring it would never come so close to destruction again. He reformed the military system, creating a network of fortified towns called baths that could serve as refuges and bases for defense. He reorganized the army so that half the men were always on duty while the other half worked their farms, ensuring that he could respond quickly to Danish attacks without leaving the land untilled. He built ships, creating what was effectively the first English navy, vessels designed to intercept Danish raiders before they could reach shore. He reformed the law code, drawing on earlier English laws but revising and systematizing them, creating a body of law that would serve as the foundation for English jurisprudence. He invited scholars from Wales and Francia and Ireland to his court, determined to revive learning in a kingdom where the Danish wars had destroyed monasteries and scattered the educated clergy. And remarkably for a king who spent so much of his reign at war, Alfred was himself a scholar. He learned Latin as an adult and translated several important works into English, including Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy and Pope Gregory's Pastoral Care. He encouraged the creation of the Anglo-Saxon chronicle, a historical record written in English rather than Latin, making it accessible to a broader audience. He believed that education was essential for good governance, that a king and his officials needed to understand not just how to fight but how to think, how to read and write and engage with ideas. Alfred died in 899, after a reign of 28 years. The kingdom he left to his son Edward was immeasurably stronger than the one he had inherited. Wessex was prosperous, well defended, culturally vibrant. The Danish threat had not disappeared, but it had been contained, and Alfred had provided both the military infrastructure and the ideological framework for future expansion. Edward the Elder, as Alfred's son came to be called to distinguish him from later King Edwards, continued his father's work. Working in partnership with his sister Ethelflaed, the Lady of the Mercians, who ruled Mercia after her husband's death, Edward gradually pushed the boundaries of English control northward and eastward. Town by town, fortress by fortress, he brought the southern Danelaw under English rule. The process took decades and required constant military campaigning, but by the time Edward died in 924, the map of England had been transformed. Where once there had been multiple kingdoms, Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, Wessex, along with various smaller entities, there was now a single kingdom of England, ruled from Wessex by a dynasty that could trace its lineage back to Alfred the Great. Edward's son Athelstan completed the unification. In 927, he conquered the last Viking kingdom of York, bringing Northumbria under English control for the first time since the Great Heathen Army had arrived 60 years earlier. He received the submission of the Welsh kings and the King of Scotland, establishing himself as the most powerful ruler in Britain, acknowledged as overlord even by those who were not technically his subjects. Ethelstan's reign marked the true beginning of England as a unified kingdom. He styled himself Rex Anglorum, King of the English, and he meant it not as an aspiration but as a description of reality. He issued laws that applied throughout his kingdom, minted coins bearing his image and title, held courts where nobles from all parts of England gathered to witness his charters and participate in governance. But unification did not mean peace. In 937, a coalition of Scots, Vikings from Dublin, and disgruntled Northumbrians who resented southern rule invaded England, determined to break Ethelstan's power. The two armies met at a place called Brunanburh, somewhere in northern England. The exact location is now lost, though many places claim the honor. The Battle of Brunanburh was remembered as one of the greatest conflicts of the age. An Old English poem celebrating Ethelstan's victory describes the carnage in vivid terms: the field running with blood, the ravens and eagles feasting on the corpses, the survivors fleeing back to their ships or to Scotland, leaving behind 5 kings and 7 earls dead on the field. Ethelstan's victory was complete, his supremacy over Britain confirmed, his kingdom secure. And yet, even as England was being united under a single crown, even as the English and Danes were gradually learning to live together in the territories of the Danelaw, even as churches were being rebuilt and learning was being revived, new problems were emerging that would test the unified kingdom in ways its founders could not have anticipated. The Danish settlers in the Danelaw were becoming English, adopting Christianity, intermarrying with their English neighbors, gradually losing their distinct identity. But new waves of Scandinavian raiders kept arriving, and these newcomers were often welcomed by the Danelaw Danes, who shared language and culture with them even if they no longer shared political interests. England's unity was fragile, dependent on strong kingship and constant vigilance. Athelstan died in 939, and the kingdom passed to his brother Edmund, then to another brother Eadred, then to Edmund's sons Eadwig and Edgar. These mid-10th century kings maintained the unity their forebears had forged, but their reigns were marked by growing tensions between the older English regions of the south and the Danish regions of the north and east. Edgar, who became king in 959 and ruled until 975, is remembered as a wise and successful king, one of the best of his dynasty. During his reign, England knew peace and prosperity. The reformed monasticism that had begun on the continent reached England, bringing new energy to religious life. Edgar worked closely with monastic reformers like Dunstan, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and Athelwold, Bishop of Winchester, who rebuilt monasteries, enforced stricter rules on monastic life, and promoted learning and liturgical excellence. Imagine Glastonbury Abbey during Edgar's reign, its church newly rebuilt in stone, its monks following the Benedictine rule with renewed fervor, its library growing with each year as scribes copied manuscripts in the scriptorium. The sound of chanting fills the church 8 times a day as the monks gather for the divine office, their voices raised in ancient Latin hymns, their prayers offered for the king and the kingdom and the salvation of all Christian souls. Outside the monastery walls, the abbey's lands stretch across the Somerset countryside, farmed by tenants who pay rent to the monks, providing the wealth that supports the community's religious and scholarly work. Edgar's reign culminated in a magnificent coronation ceremony at Bath in 973, deliberately delayed until he had ruled for 14 years, until he was 30 years old and at the height of his powers. The ceremony was designed to emphasize his authority over all Britain, and rulers from Wales and Scotland attended to acknowledge his supremacy. It established a pattern for English coronations that would be followed for centuries, some elements of which are still part of British coronation ceremonies today. But Edgar's death in 975 exposed fault lines in the kingdom's structure that had been hidden by his strong leadership. His heir, Edward, was only about 13 years old, and there was a rival claimant in Edward's younger half-brother Athelred, supported by the boy's mother Queen Elfrith and her allies. The succession dispute divided the nobility and created instability that England could ill afford. In 978, young King Edward was murdered at Corfe Castle in Dorset, stabbed while dismounting from his horse during a visit to his stepmother and half-brother. The exact circumstances remain murky. Was it a planned assassination or a spontaneous act by someone in Elfrith's household? Was Athelred complicit or merely the beneficiary of a crime he had not ordered? We cannot know. But the result was clear. Athelred became king, forever after carrying the shadow of suspicion that he had gained his throne through murder, even if his own hands were clean. Athelred would rule for 38 years, longer than any king since Alfred, but his reign would be remembered as a disaster, and he would be given a nickname that has clung to him through all the centuries since, Athelred the Unread, which meant ill-advised or poorly counseled, but which was later transformed into Athelred the Unready, a pun on his name since Athelred means noble counsel. The tragedy of Ethelred's reign was not that he was stupid or cowardly or evil. By all accounts, he was intelligent and personally brave. But he was also indecisive, easily swayed by competing advisors, unable to command the loyalty and respect that effective kingship required. and he had the misfortune to rule at a time when a new generation of Scandinavian raiders was beginning to target England with renewed intensity. These new raiders were more organized and more ambitious than the Vikings of the 9th century. They came in larger fleets, stayed longer, demanded tribute rather than merely taking plunder. In 991, after a series of damaging raids, Athelred and his council decided to pay the Vikings to go away, collecting a tax called the Danegeld to buy peace. It was a reasonable strategy in theory. If paying £10,000 of silver would convince the Vikings to depart and give England a few years of peace to rebuild and prepare, perhaps it was money well spent. But in practice, it was disastrous. The payment demonstrated that England was wealthy and that its king would pay rather than fight. More Vikings came, demanding larger payments. The Danegeld became a regular tax, collected year after year, growing from £10,000 to £16,000 to £24,000 to £36,000, an enormous burden on the English economy. And the payments did not buy peace. The Vikings would take the money, leave for a season or two, and then return demanding more. Sometimes they would raid anyway, breaking their promises, knowing that Athelred would negotiate rather than fight. The king's authority eroded with each payment, each broken promise, each failure to defend his people effectively. In 1002, Athelred made a decision that would haunt him forever. On St. Brice's Day, the 13th of November, he ordered a massacre of Danes living in England. The exact extent of the massacre is unclear. It certainly was not nationwide, and many Danes survived, particularly in the Danelaw where they were too numerous to be targeted. But in some towns, Danes were rounded up and killed, their homes burned, their possessions seized. The massacre was a catastrophic blunder. It gave Sweyn Forkbeard, the king of Denmark, a perfect justification for invasion. Sweyn's sister may have been among those killed, according to some accounts, though this might be legendary embellishment. Regardless, Sweyn now presented himself as an avenger, leading Danish armies to punish England for its treachery. For the next decade, England endured wave after wave of Danish attacks. Sweyn conquered and plundered with methodical efficiency, and Athelred could not stop him. The English army suffered defeat after defeat. Ethelred's own nobles began to doubt his leadership, to question whether he was fit to be king. Some defected to the Danish side, seeing Sweyn as the more effective ruler. In 1013, Sweyn's conquest of England was complete. Athelred fled to Normandy, where his wife Emma's brother was duke. Sweyn became king of England, the first Danish king to rule the whole country. But Sweyn's reign lasted only 5 weeks. He died suddenly in February 1014, perhaps from a stroke or heart attack, though English chroniclers like to imagine it was divine judgment for his desecration of churches. With Sweyn dead, Athelred returned from exile and reclaimed his throne, but the situation had not improved. Sweyn's son Nut was still in England with a Danish army, and he was not about to give up the kingdom his father had conquered. The struggle continued, brutal and exhausting for everyone involved. Athelred died in 1016, worn out by stress and perhaps by illness, and his son Edmund Ironside succeeded him. Edmund was everything his father was not: decisive, courageous, an inspiring military leader. He fought Nut to a standstill in a series of battles across England, showing that the Danes could be beaten by a king who was willing to lead from the front and make difficult decisions. But Edmund's success came too late. In November 1016, less than a year into his reign, Edmund died, probably from wounds sustained in battle, though poison was also rumored. And so the kingdom passed to Nut, who would rule for 19 years as King of England, and also eventually as King of Denmark and Norway, creating a North Sea empire that briefly united Scandinavia and England under a single crown. Nut was a conqueror, but he was also a pragmatist. He understood that he could not rule England by force alone, that he needed to win the acceptance of the English nobility and clergy if his rule was to be stable and lasting. Knut kept much of the English administrative system intact, appointed both Danes and Englishmen to positions of authority, patronized the church generously, and generally presented himself not as a foreign conqueror but as a legitimate English king who happened to be Danish. He married Emma of Normandy, Ethelred's widow, creating continuity with the previous dynasty while also ensuring that any sons he had by her would have both Danish and English royal blood. During Knut's reign, England knew peace and prosperity after decades of war. The king's power was real and respected. Law and order were maintained. Trade flourished. The church thrived under royal patronage. Monasteries that had been destroyed or impoverished during the wars were rebuilt and endowed. Learning and artistic production revived. One famous story about Knut shows his wisdom and self-awareness. His courtiers, seeking to flatter him, told him that his power was so great that even the elements obeyed him. Knut, annoyed by such foolish flattery, had his throne carried to the beach and sat there commanding the tide not to come in. Of course the tide ignored him, the water rising until it lapped at his feet and soaked his royal robes. Knut used this demonstration to remind his courtiers that even a king's power had limits, that only God could command the waves, and that earthly rulers should remember their mortality and limitations. Whether this story is literally true or a later invention, it captures something important about Knut's approach to kingship. He was a strong ruler, but he did not claim divine powers. He was a Christian king who acknowledged the supremacy of God and the Church. He was a Dane who respected English law and custom. He was a conqueror who sought to be more than merely a conqueror. But Knut's North Sea Empire did not survive him. When he died in 1035, his sons fought over the inheritance, and the empire fragmented. His son Harold Harefoot became King of England, ruling from 1035 to 1040, followed by Knut's other son Harthacnut, who ruled from 1040 to 1042. Neither son possessed their father's abilities, and their short, troubled reigns left most people nostalgic for Knut's firm and just rule. When Harthacnut died suddenly in 1042, apparently from a stroke while drinking at a wedding, the English nobility faced a choice. They could accept another Danish king, or they could restore the old English royal line. They chose restoration, inviting Edward, son of Athelred the Unready and Emma of Normandy, to return from exile in Normandy and claim the throne. Edward, who would become known as Edward the Confessor for his piety and devotion to the Church, had spent most of his life in Normandy, raised in his mother's homeland while England was ruled by Danes. He was nearly 40 years old when he became king, more Norman than English in his cultural formation, more interested in building churches than in warfare or politics. He was also, apparently, uninterested in marriage in any normal sense. Though he married Edith, daughter of the powerful Earl Godwin of Wessex, for political reasons, the marriage was reportedly never consummated, and Edward remained childless throughout his life. Edward's reign was long. He ruled from 1042 to 1066, and relatively peaceful, but it was also marked by growing tensions between different factions of the nobility. The most powerful family in England was the Godwins of Wessex, whose patriarch Earl Godwin had served under Knut and had helped engineer Edward's accession in exchange for the king marrying his daughter. The Godwins controlled the richest parts of England and commanded the largest military forces. In practice, they often wielded more real power than the king. Edward resented this dependency but lacked the political skill or military strength to challenge the Godwins effectively. He filled his court with Norman favorites, men he had known in exile, speaking French with them and promoting Norman customs. This alienated the English nobility, who saw these foreigners as interlopers, and particularly offended the Godwins, who saw their influence at court being undermined. The conflict came to a head in 1051, when Edward ordered Godwin to punish the town of Dover for attacking some of Edward's Norman friends. Godwin refused, and the king, sensing an opportunity, raised an army and prepared to force the issue. But neither side wanted civil war, and a compromise was reached. Godwin and his sons would go into exile, and Edith would be set aside from her position as queen. The Godwin exile lasted less than a year. In 1052, Godwin returned with a fleet and an army, and he found that the English nobility and common people supported him more than they supported the king. Edward had to back down, restoring the Godwins to their positions and taking Edith back as queen. Godwin himself died the following year, but his son Harold succeeded to his earldom and his political power, becoming the effective ruler of England under a king who was more interested in prayer than in governance. Edward devoted much of his energy to his great project, the rebuilding of Westminster Abbey. The old monastery church was replaced with a magnificent new structure in the Norman Romanesque style, with massive stone walls and rounded arches, the largest and most elaborate church yet built in England. Edward poured resources into this project, seeing it as his gift to God, his monument that would outlast his childless dynasty. He would be buried there in 1066, and the abbey would become the coronation church for all subsequent English monarchs. But as Edward grew old and his health failed, the question of succession loomed ever larger. He had no children, no direct heir. Several candidates had potential claims. Harold Godwinson, the powerful earl who had effectively governed England for years, William, Duke of Normandy, Edward's cousin, and a distant relative through Emma, Edgar Atheling, a young descendant of the Old English royal line who had returned from exile in Hungary, and Harold Hardrada, King of Norway, who claimed descent from Nut and therefore rights to the English throne. Edward died on January 5, 1066, after a brief illness. On his deathbed, according to some accounts, he gestured toward Harold Godwinson, seemingly designating him as his successor. The next day, Harold was crowned king by the Archbishop of York in the newly completed Westminster Abbey, with indecent haste that suggested uncertainty about his claimed strength. Harold faced immediate challenges from multiple directions. His own brother Tostig, whom he had exiled from his earldom of Northumbria after the locals revolted against Tostig's harsh rule, was looking for allies to help him regain his position. William of Normandy was furious at what he saw as Harold's betrayal. William claimed that Harold had sworn an oath to support William's claim to the English throne during a visit to Normandy some years earlier. And Harold Hardrada of Norway was mustering his forces, seeing England's uncertain succession as an opportunity for conquest. The storm broke in September. Harold Hardrada and Tostig sailed up the Humber with a Norwegian army, landed, and marched on York. They defeated the northern English forces at the Battle of Fulford and occupied York, demanding submission from the Northumbrians. Harold Godwinson, who had been in the south preparing to face the expected Norman invasion, force-marched his army north with remarkable speed, covering nearly 200 miles in 4 days. He caught the Norwegians by surprise at Stamford Bridge on September 25, while they were relaxing and waiting for hostages from the surrounding countryside. Many of the Norwegian warriors had left their armor with their ships, expecting no battle that day. The fight was fierce and bloody. Harold Hardrada was killed early in the battle, struck in the throat by an arrow. Tostig died fighting beside his Norwegian ally. The English shield wall held firm, and the Vikings, for all their reputation as fierce warriors, could not break through. By day's end, most of the Norwegian army lay dead on the field. It took only 24 ships to carry the survivors home, out of the 300 ships that had brought them to England. Harold had won a great victory, one of the most complete triumphs in English military history. But even as he was celebrating at York, receiving the submission of the Northumbrians and distributing rewards to his men, news arrived that would turn celebration to ashes. William of Normandy had landed on the Sussex coast with his invasion fleet. The southern shores Harold had left defended by local forces were now under attack by an army that had spent months preparing for this moment. Harold rushed south as quickly as he had marched north, covering the distance in perhaps 5 days, gathering what forces he could along the way. But his army was exhausted from the northern campaign, depleted by casualties at Stamford Bridge, and lacking the full strength that a more leisurely mobilization would have provided. The wiser course might have been to wait, to let William's forces weaken themselves through lack of supplies, to gather a larger army. But Harold was bold and confident, perhaps overconfident from his victory over Harold Hardrada, and he chose to confront the Norman Duke immediately. The two armies met near Hastings on October 14, 1066. Harold chose a defensive position on a ridge, forming his men into the traditional English shield wall, that formation that had served the Saxons so well for centuries. His elite warriors, the housecarls, stood at the center, armed with fearsome two-handed Danish axes that could split shields and helmets with a single blow. The FYRD, the local militia, filled out the line on either side. William's army was different from anything the English had faced before. It combined Norman cavalry with infantry from Brittany and archers from across northern France. The cavalry especially gave William a crucial advantage. English armies fought almost entirely on foot, even the nobles dismounting to join the shield wall. The Normans could charge, retreat, regroup, and charge again, wearing down an enemy who had to stand and receive the assault. The battle lasted all day, from mid-morning until dusk. Again and again, Norman cavalry charged up the hill toward the English shield wall. Again and again, they were thrown back by the disciplined English formation, by the axes that killed men and horses alike, by the simple defensive strength of men standing shoulder to shoulder, shields locked, refusing to yield. The Norman archers shot volley after volley of arrows, but most fell harmlessly on English shields or stuck quivering in the ground. At one point, a rumor spread that William had been killed, and part of his army began to retreat in confusion. But William rode before his men, lifting his helmet so they could see his face, shouting that he was alive and would yet win the day. The Norman retreat became a trap. Some English forces broke formation to pursue what they thought were fleeing enemies, only to be cut down by Norman cavalry that wheeled and counterattacked. As the afternoon wore on, the English position began to weaken. Casualties mounted. Fatigue set in. Men who had fought at Stamford Bridge less than 3 weeks earlier were fighting again, and the double burden was telling. The shield wall, though still intact, was thinning, gaps appearing where men had fallen and no reserves remained to fill their places. William ordered his archers to shoot high, letting their arrows fall on the English from above rather than directly into their shields. One of these high-arcing arrows struck King Harold in the eye, or so the story goes, as depicted in the Bayeux tapestry that would be created to commemorate the battle. Whether Harold was killed by an arrow to the eye or by a Norman sword in the final assault, the result was the same. As darkness fell, Harold lay dead on the ridge, and with him died the last Anglo-Saxon king of England. The English forces broke and fled. Some were cut down in the pursuit. Others escaped into the darkness, carrying with them news of the disaster. William of Normandy had won, but at tremendous cost. Thousands of his men lay dead on the field alongside the English. It had been, as one chronicler described it, a battle where victory went to neither side until the very end, where everything hung in balance until the moment when Harold fell. William marched on London, not directly but in a wide arc, burning and devastating the countryside to demonstrate what resistance would cost. The remaining English leaders, leaderless and demoralized, debated what to do. Some wanted to crown Edgar Atheling, the young Anglo-Saxon prince who had the best hereditary claim. But Edgar was only about 14 years old, untested in battle, with no military experience and no army to command. Others argued for continued resistance, for guerrilla warfare, for appealing to foreign allies. But most saw the futility of further fighting. On Christmas Day, 1066, William was crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey, the church that Edward the Confessor had built and where Edward had been buried less than a year before. The Norman conquest was complete, or so it seemed. But conquest by battle is not the same as conquest by submission. For the next 5 years, William faced rebellions and uprisings across England. In the north, the people rose against Norman rule repeatedly, allied sometimes with Danish raiders who hoped to profit from England's chaos. In the west, resistance centers held out in the marshes and forests. In the east, Danish fleets arrived, thinking to take advantage of the situation as their ancestors had done 2 centuries before. William responded with brutal efficiency. When the north rebelled, he laid waste to Yorkshire and surrounding counties in the winter of 1069 to 1070, in what came to be called the Harrying of the North. His soldiers burned farms and villages, killed livestock, destroyed food stores, poisoned wells. They turned a prosperous region into a wasteland where, according to chroniclers, people resorted to eating dogs and cats and even human flesh to survive. The devastation was so complete that parts of northern England had not fully recovered 20 years later when the Domesday Book recorded vast stretches of land still lying waste. The message was clear: rebellion would not be tolerated, and those who resisted Norman rule would suffer consequences so terrible that others would think twice before following their example. It was a strategy of terror, meant to break the spirit of resistance, and it worked. After the harrying of the North, major rebellions ceased, though resentment smoldered for generations. William redistributed land on a massive scale, the greatest transfer of property in English history. Anglo-Saxon nobles who had fought at Hastings or joined the rebellions had their lands confiscated and given to Norman followers of the king. Even those who had submitted were often dispossessed in favor of Normans. By the time William died in 1087, nearly all the major landholders in England were Norman, and the Anglo-Saxon aristocracy that had ruled England for centuries had been virtually eliminated. But William did not simply replace English nobles with Norman ones. He introduced a new system of landholding based on feudalism, the continental system that had developed in Francia and Normandy. Under this system, all land belonged ultimately to the king, who granted it to his followers in exchange for military service and other obligations. These tenants-in-chief, as they were called, might in turn grant portions of their land to their own followers, creating a chain of obligation that ran from the king down through the layers of society. This feudal system created stronger bonds of loyalty and obligation than the older English system had provided. A Norman baron held his land directly from the king and owed specific, clearly defined services in return. He knew that if he rebelled, he would lose everything. He also knew that if he served faithfully, his heirs would inherit his position. The system created stability while concentrating power firmly in the king's hands. William also transformed the church in England. He replaced almost all the English bishops and abbots with Normans, men who owed their positions to him and who shared his vision of a church organized along continental lines. He separated ecclesiastical courts from secular ones, creating a system where the church had jurisdiction over its own members and over certain types of cases, particularly those involving marriage and morality. The most visible symbol of the conquest was the building program William initiated. Across England, massive stone castles began to rise, Norman strongholds that could dominate the surrounding countryside and serve as bases for military control. The Tower of London, begun during William's reign, was the greatest of these, a massive stone keep that towered over the city, a constant reminder of who ruled England now. Smaller castles appeared in every major town and many minor ones, creating a network of Norman military power that made large-scale rebellion difficult and local resistance futile. Norman churches also began to replace English ones. The Normans favored the Romanesque style with its thick walls, round arches, massive pillars, and sense of solid, immovable strength. Durham Cathedral, begun in 1093, exemplified this style, its columns as thick as trees, its arches soaring overhead, its stone vaulting creating a sense of enclosed, protected space. These buildings were meant to last forever, to demonstrate that Norman rule was permanent, that the English would worship God in buildings designed by their conquerors. But for all the changes the Normans brought, they also preserved much of what they found. English law continued, though now interpreted by Norman judges. English administrative systems continued, particularly the shire and hundred courts where local disputes were settled. The English language continued, though now as the speech of the conquered lower classes, while Norman French became the language of the court and the nobility. English culture continued, though now overshadowed and influenced by Norman culture, creating a hybrid that was neither wholly English nor wholly Norman but something new. William himself remained fundamentally a Norman, more comfortable speaking French than English, more at home in his Duchy of Normandy than in his Kingdom of England. He divided his time between his two domains, crossing the Channel frequently, struggling to maintain control of both simultaneously. His death in 1087 came while he was campaigning in France, injured when his horse stumbled and threw him against the pommel of his saddle. He lingered for weeks before dying, and his body was carried back to Caen in Normandy for burial in the abbey he had founded there. William left his lands divided between his sons, with Robert receiving Normandy and William Rufus receiving England. This division would cause problems for decades, as each brother sought to take the other's inheritance, and as their nobles, who held lands in both England and Normandy, were torn between conflicting loyalties. William Rufus, so called because of his red hair and ruddy complexion, ruled England from 1087 to 1100. He was an effective but unpopular king, harsh in his treatment of the church, greedy for revenue, unconventional in his personal life. Contemporaries whispered that he never married, that he surrounded himself with young men who wore their hair long and dressed in effeminate fashion, that he mocked religious ceremonies and made blasphemous jokes. Whether these rumors reflected reality or merely propaganda by his enemies, particularly churchmen whose rights he trampled, is impossible to say. But they contributed to his reputation as a bad king, one whose rule offended both God and man. William Rufus died in 1100, shot by an arrow while hunting in the New Forest. Whether his death was an accident or assassination remains one of medieval England's great mysteries. The official story was that it was a hunting accident, that an arrow shot by one of his companions glanced off a tree and struck the king by mischance. But the companion who supposedly shot the arrow, Walter Tyrrell, fled immediately to France and never returned to explain what happened. And the man who benefited most from William Rufus's death was his younger brother Henry, who was present at the hunt and who rode immediately to Winchester to secure the royal treasury before rushing to London to be crowned king. Henry I, who would rule from 1100 to 1135, was perhaps the most effective of William the Conqueror's sons. He was better educated than his brothers. Contemporaries called him Beauclerk, the scholar, because he could read Latin, and he was a skilled administrator who strengthened royal government and created systems that would influence English governance for centuries. Henry also faced the problem his father had left unresolved: how to rule both England and Normandy when they were separate inheritances. His brother Robert ruled Normandy poorly, and many Norman nobles who also held English lands appealed to Henry to intervene. In 1106, Henry invaded Normandy, defeated Robert at the Battle of Tinchebrai, and imprisoned his brother for the remaining 28 years of Robert's life. England and Normandy were reunited under a single ruler, and Henry spent much of his reign crossing the Channel, governing his two domains, fighting off challenges from neighboring French lords who resented his power. Henry revolutionized the administration of royal finances by developing what came to be called the Exchequer, a system for accounting and auditing royal revenues. Officials would gather twice a year to audit the accounts of sheriffs and other royal officers, checking their accounts against tallies kept by the royal treasury. The table where they worked was covered with a checkered cloth marked in squares, which allowed calculations to be made by moving counters from square to square, a kind of physical abacus that gave the institution its name. This might seem like dry administrative detail, but it was revolutionary. For the first time, the king had systematic knowledge of his revenues and could detect corruption or incompetence in his officials. The exchequer created a professional bureaucracy that could function regardless of who was king, that preserved institutional memory and standard procedures, that made royal government more efficient and more powerful. Henry's personal life was marked by tragedy despite his political success. He had numerous illegitimate children, at least 25 by various mistresses, but only 2 legitimate children survived infancy: William Adelin, his son and heir, and Matilda, his daughter. In 1120, William drowned when the White Ship sank while crossing the Channel from Normandy to England. The prince was just 17 years old, and his death left Henry without a male heir. Henry remarried, hoping for another son, but no children came from his second marriage. And so, reluctantly, he designated his daughter Matilda as his heir, the first time a woman had been named to inherit the English crown. To strengthen her claim, he married her to Geoffrey, Count of Anjou, creating an alliance with a powerful French territory. But many English and Norman nobles were uncomfortable with the idea of being ruled by a woman, and more uncomfortable still with the thought of being ruled by Geoffrey of Anjou, whom they saw as an enemy. When Henry died in 1135, supposedly from eating too many lampreys, a kind of eel-like fish that he loved despite his doctor's warnings, the succession crisis erupted immediately. Matilda was in Anjou with her husband. Stephen of Blois, Henry's nephew, was in France but rushed to England, claimed the throne, and was crowned before Matilda could react. He argued that Henry had changed his mind on his deathbed and designated Stephen as heir, and that in any case, a woman could not rule a warrior kingdom like England. The result was a civil war that would last 19 years, a period remembered in the chronicles as the Anarchy, when Christ and his saints slept, when law and order broke down, when private wars between barons devastated the countryside. It was a time of castle building and siege warfare, of shifting alliances and broken oaths, of a kingdom torn apart by competing claims to the throne. Stephen was crowned and had possession of the royal treasury and the apparatus of government, but Matilda had the better legal claim and the support of many nobles who had sworn oaths to Henry to accept her as queen. The country divided, with some regions supporting Stephen, others supporting Matilda, and still others taking advantage of the chaos to pursue their own interests. Matilda invaded England in 1139, and for several years the war swayed back and forth. In 1141, Stephen was captured in battle and imprisoned, and Matilda seemed to have won. She entered London and prepared for her coronation. But her arrogant behavior offended the Londoners, who drove her out before she could be crowned. Stephen's wife, also named Matilda, to add to the confusion of this period, continued to fight for her husband, and eventually Stephen was exchanged for one of Matilda's captured supporters. The war dragged on with neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. Castles changed hands repeatedly. Towns were besieged, captured, lost, and recaptured. The countryside suffered as armies lived off the land, as private wars between barons added to the general chaos, as law and order collapsed in many regions. A chronicler writing about this period described the horrors ordinary people endured. Men said openly that Christ and his saints slept. They filled the land full of castles. They greatly oppressed the wretched people by making them work at these castles, and when the castles were finished they filled them with devils and evil men. Then they took those whom they suspected to have any goods, by night and by day, seizing both men and women, and they put them in prison for their gold and silver, and tortured them with pains unspeakable. Gradually, both sides grew exhausted. Matilda eventually returned to Normandy, though she never gave up her claim to be the rightful queen. Her son Henry, Geoffrey of Anjou's son, grew to manhood and took up his mother's cause, proving himself a more effective military and political leader than either his mother or Stephen had been. In 1153, when Stephen's own son and heir died suddenly, the old king finally agreed to a compromise. Stephen would remain king for the rest of his life, but Henry would be recognized as his heir, inheriting the throne when Stephen died. It was not the outcome either side had fought for, but both were too weary to continue. Stephen died the following year, in 1154, and Henry became king as Henry II, the first of the Plantagenet dynasty that would rule England for more than 3 centuries. Henry II inherited more than just England. From his father, he had Anjou and other French territories. From his mother, he had the claim to Normandy, which he had already conquered during Stephen's reign. And through his marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine, the divorced wife of the French King Louis VII, he gained control of vast territories in southern France. His empire stretched from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees, making him the most powerful ruler in Western Europe, far more powerful than the French king who was technically his overlord for his French territories. Henry was short, stocky, energetic to the point of exhaustion for those around him, with a terrible temper that could flare into volcanic rage. He could not sit still, was always moving, always working, traveling constantly throughout his vast domains to dispense justice, suppress rebellions, and ensure his officials were doing their jobs properly. He slept little, read voraciously, spoke several languages, and had a remarkable memory for faces, names, and grievances. Most importantly for England's long-term development, Henry II was a legal reformer who transformed the English judicial system in ways that are still felt today. He expanded the reach of royal justice, creating new legal procedures that allowed ordinary people to appeal to the king's courts rather than relying on local lords for justice. He sent royal judges on regular circuits throughout the kingdom, bringing consistent legal standards to every corner of the realm. Henry's legal reforms introduced the jury system, where cases would be decided not by ordeal or combat but by a panel of local men who knew the facts and could testify to the truth. He created standardized legal procedures, written records of cases and decisions, and a body of precedent that would evolve into the common law that was common to the entire kingdom, applied consistently regardless of local customs or the whims of local lords. These reforms were not motivated by abstract ideals of justice but by practical considerations of royal power and revenue. Every case heard in a royal court paid fees to the king. Every expansion of royal justice was an expansion of royal authority at the expense of local lords and their courts. But whatever Henry's motivations, the result was a legal system that provided better, more consistent justice than had previously been available, and that would become one of England's most important contributions to world civilization. Henry's relationship with the Church, however, was far more troubled. He believed that clergy who committed crimes should be tried in royal courts and subject to royal punishment, just like anyone else. The Church insisted that clergy should be tried in ecclesiastical courts, which could not impose physical punishment like mutilation or execution. The dispute escalated when Henry appointed his friend and Chancellor Thomas Becket as Archbishop of Canterbury, expecting that Becket would support the royal position. But Becket, once he became Archbishop, took the Church's side with fervor that surprised everyone, especially Henry. From being the king's loyal servant and drinking companion, Becket transformed himself into the Church's champion, defending ecclesiastical privileges, living austerely, wearing a hair shirt beneath his rich vestments. The friendship between king and archbishop turned to bitter enmity as they clashed over jurisdiction, over taxation of church lands, over the limits of royal versus ecclesiastical authority. In 1170, the conflict reached its climax. Becket had been in exile in France for 6 years, excommunicating bishops who had supported Henry. When he returned to England, still defiant, still excommunicating his enemies, Henry reportedly burst out in rage. "What miserable drones and traitors have I nourished and promoted in my household who let their lord be treated with such shameful contempt by a low-born cleric?" Or perhaps he said, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" The exact words vary in different accounts, but the meaning was clear. For knights who heard the king's outburst took it as a command. They rode to Canterbury, confronted Becket in his cathedral, and when he refused to submit to the king's will, they cut him down with their swords on the altar steps. The archbishop died a martyr, his blood staining the stones of his own church, his death witnessed by horrified monks who had tried to protect him. The murder of Thomas Becket shocked Christian Europe. Within days, miracles were being reported at his tomb. Within 3 years, he was canonized as a saint. Henry, realizing that his careless words had caused a catastrophe, did penance, walking barefoot to Canterbury and allowing himself to be flogged by the monks as punishment for his role in the murder. But the damage was done. The church had a new martyr, a powerful symbol of ecclesiastical independence from royal authority, and a shrine that would become one of the most important pilgrimage destinations in England for the next 350 years. Henry's later years were marked by family strife that must have been as painful as any political setback. His sons, encouraged by their mother Eleanor and by the French king who saw advantage in the family's disputes, repeatedly rebelled against him. Henry the young king, Richard, Geoffrey, and John, each in turn or in combination betrayed their father, fought against him, allied with his enemies. Eleanor herself was imprisoned by Henry after she supported a rebellion by their sons in 1173. She would remain under house arrest for 15 years, released only after Henry's death. The great love match between Henry and Eleanor, the most powerful couple in Europe, had turned to mutual hatred and endless conflict. Henry died in 1189, defeated in his last campaign by his son Richard and the French king, learning on his deathbed that his youngest and favorite son John had also joined the rebellion against him. His last words were reportedly, "Shame, shame on a conquered king." He was buried at Fontevraud Abbey in France, not in England, symbolizing perhaps that he was more a French ruler with English possessions than an English king with French territories. Richard I, who succeeded his father and would be remembered as Richard the Lionheart, was barely in England during his 10-year reign from 1189 to 1199. He spent perhaps 6 months total in the kingdom, seeing it primarily as a source of revenue to fund his adventures abroad. But Richard captured the medieval imagination like few other kings, becoming the model of the chivalrous warrior king, the crusader knight who fought for Christ against the infidels. Shortly after his coronation, Richard departed for the Third Crusade, joining the French King Philip Augustus and the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa in an attempt to recapture Jerusalem from Saladin, the great Muslim general who had conquered the Holy City in 1187. The crusade was a mixed success. Richard won battles, captured cities, negotiated a treaty that allowed Christian pilgrims access to Jerusalem, but failed to retake the city itself. Richard's journey home from the crusade became an adventure in itself. Shipwrecked in the Adriatic, he was captured by Duke Leopold of Austria, whom he had offended during the crusade. Leopold sold him to the Holy Roman Emperor, who held him for ransom. England had to raise an enormous sum, 150,000 marks, equivalent to several years of royal revenue, to secure their king's release. Meanwhile, Richard's brother John and the French king Philip tried to take advantage of Richard's captivity to seize his territories. Richard returned to England briefly in 1194, just long enough to reassert his authority and raise more money, then departed again for France where he spent the remaining years of his reign fighting to recover territories Philip had seized. He died in 1199, struck by a crossbow bolt during the siege of an insignificant castle, the wound turning gangrenous. He was 41 years old, and despite his legendary reputation, his 10-year reign had cost England dearly in money and attention, while accomplishing little of lasting value for the kingdom. John, the youngest of Henry II's sons, inherited the throne in 1199, and he would go on to become one of England's most controversial kings. Later generations would remember him as a tyrant, a villain, the king who lost Normandy and was forced by his barons to sign Magna Carta. But John was not simply evil or incompetent. He was intelligent, hard-working, personally courageous, and in many ways a capable administrator. His great flaw was that he combined these qualities with paranoia, cruelty, and a gift for making enemies even of those who wanted to be his friends. John's reign began badly with a dispute over the succession. Some argued that Arthur, the son of John's deceased older brother Geoffrey, had a better claim to the throne. Philip Augustus of France supported Arthur, seeing an opportunity to weaken the English/Plantagenet Empire. John captured Arthur in battle in 1202, imprisoned him, and the young man disappeared, almost certainly murdered on John's orders. Whether John killed his nephew with his own hands, as some rumors claimed, or simply ordered his death, the result was the same. John was widely believed to have murdered a boy who had a legitimate claim to the throne. Philip Augustus, who had been waiting for an excuse to attack John's French territories, declared John's lands forfeit and invaded. In a series of campaigns over the next few years, John lost Normandy, Anjou, and most of his other French possessions. The great empire that Henry II had built crumbled away, leaving John with only England and part of Aquitaine. English barons who had held lands in both England and Normandy now had to choose where their primary loyalty lay, and this forced choice created resentments that would fester for years. To make matters worse, John quarreled with Pope Innocent III over who should be Archbishop of Canterbury. When the Canterbury monks elected someone John didn't approve of, the king rejected the election. The Pope consecrated his own candidate, Stephen Langton, and ordered John to accept him. John refused. The Pope responded by placing England under an interdict in 1208, suspending most religious services throughout the kingdom. For 6 years, churches stood empty, bells did not ring, the dead were buried without ceremony in unconsecrated ground. For a deeply religious population, this was a catastrophe almost beyond imagining: to live without the sacraments, to die without last rites, to exist cut off from God's grace. And everyone knew it was the king's stubbornness that had brought this suffering upon them. The interdict hardened English opinion against John, making him seem not just a bad king but a godless tyrant. In 1212, threatened with deposition and invasion, John finally submitted to the Pope, accepting Langton as Archbishop and making England a papal fief, technically giving his kingdom to the Pope and receiving it back as a papal vassal. It was a humiliation, but it was also a masterstroke of survival. Now anyone who attacked John would be attacking the Pope's vassal, and Innocent III became John's protector rather than his enemy. But the damage to John's reputation was irreparable. The English barons, already angry over his loss of Normandy, his heavy taxation, his arbitrary justice, and his tendency to take their daughters and wives as hostages or mistresses, began to organize resistance. In 1215, they confronted the king at Runnymede, a meadow by the Thames, and presented him with a list of demands that would limit royal power and protect baronial rights. The document they forced John to seal was Magna Carta, the Great Charter, and although John had no intention of honoring it, he appealed to the Pope almost immediately, and Innocent III declared it invalid. It would become one of the most important documents in the history of English liberty. Magna Carta established the principle that even the king was subject to law, that royal power had limits, that the rights of subjects could not be arbitrarily violated. Most of Magna Carta's 63 clauses dealt with specific feudal grievances: how much the king could charge for wardships and inheritances, what rights widows should have, how debts should be collected. But some clauses spoke to broader principles that would resonate through the centuries. Clause 39 declared that no freeman could be imprisoned, dispossessed, outlawed, or exiled except by the lawful judgment of his peers or by the law of the land. Clause 40 said that the king could not sell, deny, or delay justice to anyone. These principles, though initially meant to protect only the barons and free men, would gradually expand to encompass all people. Later generations would look back to Magna Carta as the foundation of constitutional government, the source of trial by jury, the protection against arbitrary arrest. The document itself would be reissued multiple times in the 13th century, each reissue confirming that even in medieval England, there were limits to royal power that not even the strongest king could safely ignore. John died in 1216, only a year after sealing Magna Carta, apparently from dysentery contracted while campaigning in the east of England. He was only 48 years old, but his reign had been so troubled and troubling that few mourned him. His 9-year-old son inherited the throne as Henry III, and regents would rule in the boy's name until he came of age. Henry III's long reign, from 1216 to 1272, would see the consolidation of Magna Carta's principles, the development of Parliament as an institution, and the gradual evolution of England from a personal monarchy where the king's will was law into a more constitutional system where governance required consultation and consent from the realm's leading men. But that is a story that deserves its own time and space, its own careful unfolding. We have traveled now from the Roman departure through more than 8 centuries of English history, through invasions and conquests, through the rise and fall of kingdoms, through the transformation of a collection of warring territories into something recognizable as England. We have seen the arrival of the Saxons, the Viking raids and settlement, the Norman conquest and its aftermath, the development of legal and governmental institutions that would shape not just England but eventually much of the world. And still we have only reached the middle of the medieval period. Still ahead lie the reigns of Edward I, Edward II, Edward III, the 100 Years' War with France, the Black Death that would kill a third of the population, the Peasants' Revolt, the deposition of Richard II, the Wars of the Roses, and finally the Tudor Ascension that would mark the transition from medieval to early modern England. These stories too are part of the great tapestry of medieval English history, but for now, let us pause and catch our breath. Let us rest here in the early 13th century and reflect on how far we have come. The England of Henry III's childhood was vastly different from the Britain that the Romans left. It had a unified government, a common language, though that language was now evolving into something we would recognize as Middle English. A shared Christian culture, and institutions of law and governance that made it recognizably a nation rather than merely a geographical expression. Young Henry III came to the throne in circumstances as dark as any in English history. His father's death had left the kingdom in the midst of civil war, with French forces occupying London and much of the south, with barons divided between those who remained loyal to the Plantagenet crown and those who had invited Prince Louis of France to take the throne. The boy king's coronation took place not in the grand surroundings of Westminster Abbey but in the modest setting of Gloucester Cathedral, and he was crowned not with the proper crown, which was in enemy hands, but with his mother's simple gold circlet. But fortune sometimes favors the weak, and in Henry's case, his very youth and vulnerability became his greatest asset. The regents who governed in his name were experienced, capable men who understood that the kingdom could not survive continued civil war. Chief among them was William Marshal, now in his 70s but still commanding respect as the greatest knight of his age, a man who had served 4 kings and who brought to the regency a lifetime of wisdom and military skill. Marshal recognized that the key to peace lay in reconciliation, not revenge. He reissued Magna Carta almost immediately, showing that the new government would respect the barons' rights and liberties. This simple act transformed the political landscape. Barons who had rebelled against John could now return to their allegiance without shame, supporting not a tyrannical king but a legitimate monarchy that acknowledged limits to its power. One by one, the rebel barons made their peace with the young king's government. The French, meanwhile, began to lose their luster as liberators. Prince Louis, it became clear, was more interested in conquering England for himself than in serving as the barons' champion against tyranny. His foreign troops lived off the land, taking what they needed, treating England as enemy territory. The comparison with the Regency government, which was orderly and respectful of rights, grew increasingly favorable. In 1217, William Marshal led the Royalist forces to victory at the Battle of Lincoln, where despite his advanced age he fought in full armor at the head of his troops, inspiring them with his courage. Shortly after, a French fleet bringing reinforcements was defeated at sea in the Battle of Sandwich. These twin victories broke the back of the French invasion, and Louis, seeing that his cause was lost, negotiated his withdrawal in exchange for payment and a safe return to France. William Marshal died in 1219, having saved England one last time. On his deathbed, he was received into the Knights Templar, fulfilling a vow he had made years before. He was buried in Temple Church in London, where his effigy can still be seen today, carved in stone, showing him as he wished to be remembered, a knight in full armor, his hands clasped in prayer, his sword at his side. The epitaph on his tomb proclaimed him the best knight that ever lived, and few who knew him would have disagreed. As Henry III grew to manhood and began to rule in his own right, it became clear that he had inherited his father's piety and artistic sensibility but not his political acumen or military skill. Henry loved beauty, ceremony, and religious devotion. He rebuilt Westminster Abbey in the new Gothic style that was revolutionizing church architecture on the continent, creating a soaring masterpiece of pointed arches and flying buttresses, of stained glass that filled the interior with colored light, of stone carved into lacy patterns that seemed to deny the material's weight and solidity. Henry's Westminster Abbey was more than just a church. It was a political statement, a shrine to Edward the Confessor whom Henry particularly venerated, and a burial place for English kings that would rival the great French royal abbey at St. Denis. The building consumed vast resources, required the finest craftsmen that Europe could provide, and took decades to complete. But when it was finished, it was undeniably magnificent, one of the architectural triumphs of medieval Europe. The king's personal piety expressed itself in other ways too. He attended Mass multiple times daily, gave generously to monasteries and churches, went on pilgrimage, and collected holy relics with the enthusiasm of a passionate devotee. When someone brought him what was claimed to be a vial of Christ's blood, Henry greeted it with tears of joy and built a special shrine to house it. Whether the relic was genuine or not, and even medieval people had doubts about the authenticity of many relics, Henry's faith in it was absolutely sincere. But sincere piety did not make Henry a good king. He lacked his father's energy and his grandfather's administrative genius. He was easily influenced by favorites, generous to a fault with royal resources, and deeply impractical in his political ambitions. His marriage to Eleanor of Provence brought her relatives flocking to England, where Henry gave them positions of power and enriched them with grants of land and money. The English barons, who had hoped that John's death would mean the end of foreign influence at court, watched with growing resentment as Provençal and Savoyard relatives of the Queen accumulated wealth and power. Henry's financial problems grew steadily worse. The rebuilding of Westminster Abbey was phenomenally expensive. His attempts to win back the French territories his father had lost consumed resources without achieving success. His support for a papal project to make his son Edmund King of Sicily, a scheme that was wildly impractical and ultimately failed, cost enormous sums. And his generosity to favorites meant that royal revenues that should have been saved or invested in governance were instead distributed as gifts. To pay for all this, Henry had to ask his barons for money repeatedly, calling them to councils where he requested taxes and subsidies. The barons began to demand concessions in return, not just the reaffirmation of Magna Carta, which Henry had sworn to multiple times already, but actual participation in governance. They wanted oversight of how royal money was spent. They wanted royal officials to be accountable to something more than just the king's pleasure. They wanted a say in major policy decisions. The conflict came to a head in 1258, when a group of barons led by Simon de Montfort, Earl of Leicester, forced Henry to accept what came to be called the Provisions of Oxford. These provisions created a council of 15 barons who would advise the king and effectively control major decisions. The king's own household would be supervised by baronial appointees. Royal castles would be held by men the council trusted. It was, in effect, a baronial takeover of the government, justified by the argument that Henry had shown himself incapable of ruling effectively without guidance. Simon de Montfort is one of the most fascinating and controversial figures of 13th century England. He was born in France, the younger son of a French nobleman who had led the crusade against the Albigensian heretics in southern France. Simon came to England to claim an earldom through his grandmother's inheritance and quickly became one of Henry's favorites. The king gave him in marriage his own sister Eleanor, making Simon a member of the royal family. But Simon was also deeply principled, passionate about justice and good governance, convinced that the kingdom was being ruined by the king's weakness and the influence of foreign favorites, among whom he himself had once been numbered. When he broke with Henry and became the leader of the baronial reform movement, it was not from personal ambition alone but from genuine belief that England needed to be saved from its own king. The provisions of Oxford did not last. Henry, with papal support, repudiated them in 1261, arguing that they violated his royal prerogatives and that he had been forced to accept them under duress. The country drifted toward civil war, with the king and his loyalists on one side and the reformist barons led by Simon de Montfort on the other. The war broke out in 1263, and it revealed something extraordinary. Simon de Montfort was not content to be merely the leader of a baronial faction. He positioned himself as the champion of the whole community of the realm, claiming to fight not for narrow aristocratic interests but for justice and good governance that would benefit all of England. He made alliances with townsmen, he sought support from lesser knights who were not part of the great baronial families, he even, most remarkably, appealed to ordinary people to support his cause. At the Battle of Lewes in 1264, Simon's forces defeated the royalist army and captured King Henry and his son Prince Edward. For the next year, Simon de Montfort effectively ruled England in the king's name, and he used that power to summon what many historians consider the first real English parliament. In 1265, Simon called representatives not just from the baronage and the church, but also 2 knights from each shire and 2 burgesses from each major town, creating an assembly that represented, however imperfectly, the various communities of England. This was revolutionary. Previous royal councils had been assemblies of the great men of the realm, bishops, abbots, earls, and barons. But Simon's parliament included representatives of groups that had never before been formally consulted about national governance. It established a precedent that would grow in importance over the coming centuries, the idea that legitimate government required not just the consent of the aristocracy but some form of broader representation. But Simon's triumph was brief. In 1265, Prince Edward escaped from his captors and raised a new royalist army. At the Battle of Evesham, fought on an August day when thunder rolled across the Severn Valley and rain fell in torrents, the royalist forces trapped and annihilated Simon's army. The reformist leader was killed in the fighting, his body mutilated by his enemies, his head, hands, and feet cut off as trophies, his testicles sent as a mockery to a lady he had allegedly offended. It was a brutal end for a man who, whatever his flaws and ambitions, had genuinely believed he was fighting for justice. The Battle of Evesham ended the baronial revolt, but it could not undo Simon de Montfort's legacy. Prince Edward, who had learned hard lessons from his father's mistakes and from Simon's successes, understood that effective monarchy required more than just defeating opponents. It required building consensus, working within legal frameworks, and giving England's various communities a voice in governance. When Edward became king in 1272, he would prove to be one of England's greatest medieval monarchs, in large part because he had learned these lessons. Edward I, who ruled from 1272 to 1307, was everything his father was not. He was tall, 6 feet 2 inches in a time when the average man stood 5.5 feet, physically imposing, an excellent soldier, a skilled administrator, and a king of iron will. His contemporaries called him Longshanks for his height and the Hammer of the Scots for his campaigns in Scotland. He was ruthless when he judged ruthlessness necessary, but he was also a lawgiver who understood that stable governance required more than just force. Edward's reign saw major legal reforms that earned him the nickname, the English Justinian, comparing him to the great Roman emperor who had codified Roman law. Edward's statutes addressed everything from land tenure to criminal procedure, from the rights of townsmen to the regulation of trade. The First Statute of Westminster in 1275 reformed the criminal law and improved procedures for protecting property rights. The Statute of Gloucester in 1278 defined the jurisdiction of different courts. The Statute of Mortmain in 1279 limited the church's ability to acquire land without royal permission. These statutes and others created a framework of statute law that complemented the common law developed through judicial decisions, giving England one of the most sophisticated legal systems in medieval Europe. Edward also regularized the summoning of Parliament, making it a normal part of English governance rather than an exceptional measure taken only in times of crisis. He needed money for his wars, and Edward was almost constantly at war, and he needed the consent of the communities of England to levy the taxes that would fund those wars. So he summoned parliaments regularly, following the pattern Simon de Montfort had established, including not just the great lords and prelates but also representatives of the shires and towns. These parliaments were not democratic in any modern sense. The representatives were elected, but by very restricted franchises. They had no power to initiate legislation, only to petition the king for redress of grievances and to consent to or withhold taxes. But they were assemblies where the king had to explain his policies, where grievances could be aired, where some degree of consultation and consent was required before major decisions could be implemented. Parliament was becoming an institution, with established procedures and recognized rights, rather than merely an occasional gathering of the king's subjects. Edward's foreign policy was aggressive and expansionist. In Wales, he faced a challenge from Llywelyn ap Griffith, the last native prince who ruled an independent Welsh principality in the north and west. Llywelyn had taken advantage of the chaos during Henry III's reign to expand his power, styling himself Prince of Wales and seeking to create a unified Welsh state that could stand as an equal to England. Edward would not tolerate an independent Welsh power on his western frontier. The conquest of Wales took two wars, fought in 1277 and 1282. Edward brought overwhelming military force to bear, combining naval power to cut off coastal supply routes with a network of supply bases and roads that allowed his armies to operate even in the mountainous Welsh heartland. The Welsh, fighting on their own terrain and using guerrilla tactics that had frustrated English armies for centuries, could not withstand the methodical, well-supplied English forces. Llywelyn was killed in battle in 1282, not in some dramatic final stand but in a minor skirmish where he was surprised and cut down before anyone even realized who he was. His brother Dafydd continued the resistance for a few months, but was captured and executed as a traitor, suffering the gruesome death reserved for traitors, hanged, drawn, and quartered, his body parts sent to different English towns as warning of what happened to those who defied the English king. To secure his conquest, Edward built a ring of massive stone castles around the edges of the conquered Welsh heartland, Carnarvon, Conwy, Harlech, Beaumaris, and others. These were not the simple fortifications of earlier centuries but sophisticated military architecture incorporating the latest developments in defensive design, concentric walls, towers positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire, sophisticated gates with multiple portcullises and murder holes. They were also phenomenally expensive, costing more than Edward's entire annual royal revenue to build, but they achieved their purpose. The castles dominated the landscape, controlled key routes, and made Welsh rebellion militarily futile. Edward also imposed English law and administration on Wales, dividing the conquered territories into counties with English officials, settling English colonists in new towns founded under the protection of his castles. The Welsh were not entirely dispossessed, they continued to farm their lands, maintain their language and culture, and preserve their distinct identity. But Welsh political independence was finished, and Wales was now firmly incorporated into the English realm. In 1284, Edward formalized this arrangement by giving his infant son, born at Carnarvon Castle, the title Prince of Wales. The tradition that the English monarch's eldest son bears this title continues to this day, a legacy of Edward I's conquest more than 7 centuries ago. But Wales, though challenging, was only a prelude to the greater struggle that would define Edward's later years and haunt England for centuries, the war with Scotland. Scotland in the late 13th century was a kingdom in its own right, with its own laws, its own church, its own nobility, and a relationship with England that was complex and ambiguous. Scottish kings had sometimes acknowledged English overlordship, but this acknowledgement was vague and disputed, and Scotland was clearly a separate realm, not part of England. In 1286, King Alexander III of Scotland died in a riding accident, leaving as his heir his infant granddaughter Margaret, the Maid of Norway. Edward proposed a marriage between Margaret and his own son, which would eventually unite the Scottish and English crowns peacefully. But in 1290, as Margaret was sailing from Norway to Scotland, she died during the voyage, perhaps from seasickness, perhaps from the harsh North Sea weather. She was only 7 years old, and her death plunged Scotland into a succession crisis. Multiple candidates claimed the Scottish throne, each with some hereditary right, each with powerful supporters. The Scottish magnates, unable to decide among themselves and fearing civil war, made a fateful decision. They asked Edward I of England to arbitrate the dispute, to decide who should be King of Scotland. Edward agreed, but he demanded that all the candidates first acknowledge him as overlord of Scotland, with the right to hear appeals from Scottish courts and to intervene in Scottish affairs. Most of the candidates, desperate for Edward's support, agreed to this demand. Edward chose John Balliol as king, calculating that Balliol, who had strong claims but weak support among the Scottish nobility, would be dependent on English backing and therefore more amenable to English control. For a time, the arrangement seemed to work. Balliol was crowned in 1292, did homage to Edward for the Kingdom of Scotland, and accepted the role of a vassal king under English overlordship. But Edward pushed too hard, treating Scotland not as a separate kingdom whose king owed him feudal allegiance but as a conquered province that could be ruled directly from Westminster. He summoned Balliol to answer Scottish legal cases in English courts. He demanded that Scottish forces serve in his wars against France. He treated the Scottish king with contempt, humiliating him in front of English courtiers. The Scottish nobility, outraged by this treatment of their king and their kingdom, forced Balliol to repudiate his allegiance to Edward and to make an alliance with France instead. This was the beginning of what would be called the Auld Alliance, the long partnership between Scotland and France against their common English enemy, a partnership that would shape the politics of Britain for the next 3 centuries. Edward's response to Scottish defiance was swift and brutal. In 1296, he invaded Scotland with overwhelming force, captured Balliol, and removed him from power. The Scottish regalia. The crown, the scepter, the stone of Scone on which Scottish kings had been inaugurated for centuries, were taken to England as spoils of war. Edward declared himself direct ruler of Scotland and appointed English officials to govern in his name. Scotland, like Wales, seemed to have been conquered and absorbed into an expanding English realm. But Scotland refused to accept conquest. In 1297, a Scottish knight named William Wallace raised the standard of rebellion, gathering an army of commoners and lesser nobles who refused to submit to English rule. Wallace was not of the great noble families, did not have the lineage that might have made him an obvious leader, but he had courage, military skill, and a burning hatred of the English occupation. Under his leadership, the Scots won a stunning victory at Stirling Bridge, where they destroyed an English army led by some of Edward's best commanders. Wallace's victory electrified Scotland. Here was proof that the English could be beaten, that ordinary Scots fighting for their freedom could defeat professional English soldiers. Wallace was named Guardian of Scotland, ruling in the name of the deposed King John Balliol, leading continued resistance against Edward's forces. Edward returned to Scotland in person in 1298, determined to crush the rebellion himself. At Falkirk, his army met Wallace's forces in a pitched battle. The Scottish spearmen, formed in defensive circles called schilprons, held firm against English cavalry charges, their long spears creating a bristling hedge that horses would not penetrate. But Edward's Welsh longbowmen, shooting volleys of arrows into the packed Scottish formations, broke the schilprons apart. Wallace's army was destroyed, though Wallace himself escaped. For the next 7 years, Wallace lived as an outlaw, continuing to resist but unable to raise another army that could face the English in open battle. In 1305, he was betrayed, captured, and brought to London. Edward had him tried for treason, a legally questionable charge since Wallace had never sworn allegiance to Edward and could not therefore have betrayed him, and condemned to the brutal death reserved for traitors. Wallace was hanged until nearly dead, then cut down and disemboweled while still alive, his entrails burned before his eyes, then finally beheaded and quartered, his head placed on London Bridge and his body parts sent to Scotland as warnings. But Wallace's death did not end Scottish resistance. Instead, it created a martyr whose memory would inspire the Scots for generations. And into the vacuum of leadership left by Wallace's death stepped Robert Bruce, Earl of Carrick, who had his own claim to the Scottish throne and his own reasons to hate English rule. Robert Bruce's path to becoming Scotland's champion was complicated and morally ambiguous. He had sometimes fought for the English, sometimes for the Scots, always calculating his own advantage, waiting for the right moment to make his bid for the throne. In 1306, that moment came. Bruce murdered his rival John Comyn in a church at Dumfries, a shocking act of sacrilege that earned him excommunication, and then had himself crowned King of Scots at Scone. Edward I, now in his 60s and suffering from the illnesses that would soon kill him, mounted one last invasion of Scotland, determined to crush Bruce as he had crushed Wallace. But the old king's body gave out before he could complete the campaign. In July 1307, as his army was marching north, Edward died near Carlisle, on the very threshold of Scotland. His last orders to his son were to carry his bones at the head of the English army until Scotland was finally conquered, and never to give up the war until Scotland submitted completely. Edward I's death marked the end of an era. His reign had transformed England, strengthening royal government, developing Parliament as an institution, conquering Wales, and nearly conquering Scotland. He had been a strong king, often a harsh one, sometimes a cruel one, but unquestionably an effective one. The realm he left to his son was unified, well-governed, and powerful. But he also left a legacy of war with Scotland that would poison relations between the two kingdoms for centuries, consuming resources and lives in conflicts that neither side could win decisively but neither would abandon. Edward II, who inherited the throne in 1307, was as unlike his formidable father as could be imagined. Where Edward I had been a warrior king who lived for military glory and effective governance, Edward II was more interested in rustic sports, manual labor, and the company of male favorites. Medieval chroniclers described him swimming, digging ditches, thatching roofs, and driving wagons, activities that might seem harmless enough to us but that contemporaries found deeply inappropriate for a king. Kings were supposed to hunt and joust and make war, not engage in the pastimes of common laborers. More scandalous than Edward II's unusual hobbies was his relationship with Piers Gaveston, a Gascon knight whom the old king had exiled precisely because of his inappropriate influence over the young prince. Edward II recalled Gaveston immediately upon his accession, showered him with titles and lands, and displayed such obvious favoritism that it shocked even the tolerant standards of medieval court life. Whether the relationship was sexual, as many contemporaries suspected, or merely an intense emotional attachment, Edward's devotion to Gaveston was absolute and politically disastrous. The English barons, led by the king's own cousin Thomas, Earl of Lancaster, demanded that Gaveston be exiled. Edward reluctantly agreed, but kept bringing his favorite back, provoking crisis after crisis. Finally, in 1312, a group of barons captured Gaveston and executed him without trial, stabbing him to death on a roadside like a common criminal. Edward was devastated, and though he lacked the strength or political skill to punish his cousin Lancaster and the other nobles responsible, he never forgave them. Edward's troubles were compounded by his military failures in Scotland. Robert Bruce, given time to consolidate his power while Edward focused on his domestic disputes, gradually reclaimed Scotland from English occupation. Castle after castle fell to Bruce's forces, often through clever stratagems rather than direct assault. By 1314, only Stirling Castle remained in English hands, and its garrison had agreed to surrender if not relieved by midsummer. Edward gathered a massive army, perhaps 20,000 men, one of the largest English forces ever assembled, and marched north to relieve Stirling and crush Bruce once and for all. The two armies met at Bannockburn on June 24, 1314, and what followed was one of the most decisive battles in British history. Bruce chose his ground carefully, positioning his forces on firm ground while the English would have to advance through marshy terrain crossed by streams. When the English cavalry charged, they found themselves funneled into narrow fronts where their numbers became a disadvantage. The Scottish spearmen, formed in their schiltrons, held firm against charge after charge. English knights, weighed down by armor, fell from their horses into bogs and streams and drowned. The English archers, who had been so effective at Falkirk, could not get into position to support the cavalry. The entire English battle plan dissolved into chaos. Edward II, showing rare physical courage if not tactical wisdom, was nearly captured in the fighting. His bodyguards had to drag him from the field, and the king fled north and then by ship back to England, leaving his army to its fate. Thousands of English soldiers were killed or captured. The English baggage train, containing the king's treasure and supplies, fell into Scottish hands. It was a catastrophic defeat, and it secured Scottish independence for generations. The years following Bannockburn were dark for England. Bruce raided the northern counties year after year, burning, looting, and demanding tribute to leave towns and villages unharmed. Edward II, lacking both the military skill to defeat the Scots and the political authority to rally his nobles behind him, could do little to stop these depredations. The north of England, which had been relatively prosperous, became a war zone, with communities paying protection money to the Scots to avoid being burned out. Edward sought solace in a new favorite, Hugh Despenser the Younger, and his father, also named Hugh Despenser. The Despensers enriched themselves through the king's favor even more blatantly than Gaveston had, and they were far more politically ruthless. They used their position to settle scores, to steal lands from their enemies, and to accumulate a private empire in Wales and the Marches. Their greed and arrogance united virtually the entire English nobility against them and against the king who protected them. In 1321, the barons rose in rebellion again, this time led by the Marcher lords whose lands the Despensers had seized. The rebels captured and executed several of the king's supporters, but Edward rallied, defeated the rebels at the Battle of Barbridge in 1322, and took terrible revenge. His cousin Thomas of Lancaster, who had been implicated in the rebellion, was executed, the first time an English earl had been judicially killed since the Norman conquest. Other rebels were hunted down and killed. For a brief moment, Edward seemed to have mastered his kingdom. But the king's triumph was hollow. His queen, Isabella of France, had grown to hate him and his favorites. When Edward sent her to France in 1325 to negotiate with her brother, the French king, she refused to return. Instead, she gathered around her exiled English nobles who opposed Edward and his Despensers, and she took as her lover Roger Mortimer, a Marcher lord who had escaped from the Tower of London and fled to France. In 1326, Isabella and Mortimer invaded England with a small force of mercenaries and exiles. They expected resistance, perhaps civil war. Instead, they found that virtually no one was willing to fight for Edward II. The king's support simply evaporated. Nobles flocked to Isabella's banner. Towns opened their gates to her. Even the Despensers' own retainers abandoned them. Within weeks, the Despensers were captured and executed with exceptional cruelty, hanged, drawn, and quartered while still alive, their screams audible across the crowds that came to watch. Edward himself was hunted across Wales, captured, and imprisoned. In January 1327, a parliament declared him deposed, the first time an English king had been formally removed from power by constitutional process rather than simply killed in battle or murdered by rivals. Edward's 14-year-old son was crowned as Edward III, with Isabella and Mortimer ruling as regents during his minority. The deposed Edward II was moved from castle to castle, a dangerous prisoner whose very existence threatened the new regime. In September 1327, it was announced that he had died at Berkeley Castle. The official story was that he died from natural causes, perhaps from depression and poor health. But darker rumors circulated immediately and have persisted ever since, that he was murdered, possibly in a particularly gruesome fashion designed to leave no visible marks on his body. Whether Edward II died naturally or was murdered, his death removed a problem for Isabella and Mortimer, allowing them to consolidate their power without the threat of a restoration movement. For 3 years, Isabella and Mortimer ruled England in young Edward III's name, enriching themselves, distributing lands and titles to their supporters, and making themselves increasingly unpopular. They made peace with Scotland on terms that many English nobles found humiliating, recognizing Robert Bruce as king and effectively abandoning England's claim to overlordship. They executed the Earl of Kent on trumped-up charges because he posed a threat to their power. But in 1330, Edward III, now 17 years old, staged a coup against his mother and her lover. With a group of trusted young nobles, he entered Nottingham Castle through a secret passageway, surprised Mortimer in his chambers, and arrested him. Isabella supposedly cried out, "Fair son, have pity on the gentle Mortimer," but Edward was done taking orders from his mother. Mortimer was tried, convicted, and hanged. Isabella was retired to comfortable but supervised retirement in Castle Rising, where she would live for another 28 years, praying and doing penance, the she-wolf of France who had destroyed one king and raised another, now reduced to a religious recluse. Edward III, finally ruling in his own right, would become one of England's most successful medieval kings, reigning for 50 years from 1330 to 1377. He combined military prowess, political skill, and a genius for public relations that made him popular with both nobles and commoners. He was tall, handsome, an excellent juster and warrior, generous to his friends, terrible to his enemies, and possessed of the royal charisma that his father had so conspicuously lacked. Early in his reign, Edward revived English claims to the French throne itself. His mother Isabella was the daughter of King Philip IV of France, and when her 3 brothers died without male heirs, Edward argued that the French crown should pass to him through his mother. The French rejected this claim, arguing that the crown could not pass through a woman, and they gave the throne instead to Philip of Valois, a cousin of the last king who descended through the male line. This dispute over the French succession would trigger the 100 Years' War, that long series of conflicts between England and France that would stretch from 1337 to 1453. Edward was not initially committed to conquering France. His claim to the French throne was more a negotiating position than a serious ambition, but events and opportunities drew him deeper into French affairs until full-scale war became inevitable. The early English campaigns in France were startlingly successful. At Sluis in 1340, an English fleet destroyed the French navy in a battle so complete that, according to one chronicler, if fish could speak they would now know French, so many French sailors had been drowned. At Crécy in 1346, Edward's army, outnumbered by the French, won a crushing victory that demonstrated the effectiveness of English longbow tactics against French chivalric charges. The Battle of Crécy became legendary, partly because of the dramatic circumstances, the late afternoon sun breaking through storm clouds, the French cavalry charging uphill against English positions, the storm of arrows that darkened the sky, and partly because it showed how discipline and good tactics could overcome superior numbers. The French knights, despite their individual courage and skill, could not break the English line. They charged again and again, as chivalric honor demanded, and again they were cut down by arrows or impaled on English spears. By nightfall, thousands of French nobles lay dead, including the King of Bohemia who, though blind, had insisted on being led into battle tied to his companions' horses so he could strike at least one blow against the enemy. After Crécy, Edward besieged and captured Calais, giving England a permanent foothold on the French coast that it would hold for more than 200 years. Calais became England's gateway to France, a secure port where armies could land, a base for raids into French territory, and a symbol of English power on the continent. Edward's son, also named Edward but known to history as the Black Prince because of the black armor he supposedly wore, proved to be an even better general than his father. In 1356, the Black Prince led a raid deep into southern France, and on his way back north, was intercepted by a larger French army under King John II. At Poitiers, the Black Prince won a victory even more complete than Crécy. The French king himself was captured, along with his son and much of the French nobility. It was an incredible triumph, and it seemed for a moment that England might dictate terms to a prostrate France. But winning battles is easier than winning wars, and occupying France proved far more difficult than defeating French armies. The French refused to accept the harsh peace terms Edward demanded, and even with their king in captivity, they continued to resist. The war dragged on, year after year, with periods of intense fighting alternating with truces and negotiations. English armies could march through France almost at will, but they could not hold territory permanently, could not force the French to submit, could not make their military victories translate into political control. And then, in 1348, as the war was reaching its height, a far more terrible enemy arrived, the Black Death. The plague had originated in Central Asia, had traveled along trade routes to the Black Sea, and from there to Mediterranean ports. Italian ships brought it to France, and from France it spread to England, arriving probably at Melcombe Regis in Dorset in June 1348. The Black Death was unlike anything Europe had experienced in living memory. The symptoms were terrifying: swellings in the neck, armpits, and groin, called buboes, which gave the disease its name, dark patches on the skin from subcutaneous bleeding, fever, vomiting, and excruciating pain, and usually, within 3 to 5 days, death. Some victims died so quickly that they went to bed healthy and were dead by morning. Others lingered for a week or more in agony. Few who contracted the disease survived. The plague spread with horrifying speed. From Dorset it moved through southern England, reached London by autumn, and by spring of 1349 had infected the entire country. No one knew what caused it. Medieval medicine had no understanding of bacteria, no knowledge that the disease was spread by fleas that lived on rats. They thought it might be caused by corrupted air, by divine punishment for sin, by the alignment of planets, by poisoned wells, by almost anything except the real cause. And because they didn't understand what caused it, they had no way to prevent or cure it. The mortality was catastrophic. Modern historians estimate that between 1/3 and 1/2 of England's population died in the initial outbreak of 1348 to 1350. Some villages were completely wiped out, their houses standing empty, their fields returning to wilderness. In cities, the death rate was even higher, perhaps half or more of London's population perished. Bodies piled up faster than they could be buried. Churchyards filled to overflowing. Priests who came to administer last rites caught the plague and died themselves, leaving people to die without the comfort of the sacraments. The social and economic disruption was immense. With so many dead, there were not enough people to harvest crops, to tend animals, to perform the 1,000 daily tasks that kept medieval society functioning. Fields went unplowed, animals wandered untended, trades and crafts lost their skilled practitioners. The survivors found themselves in a world transformed, where labor was suddenly scarce and therefore valuable, where old certainties had dissolved, where the social order that had seemed natural and permanent had been shaken to its foundations. Before the plague, England had been overpopulated relative to its agricultural capacity. There were more people than there was good land to support them, which meant that landlords could dictate harsh terms to their tenants. Peasants were often tied to the land through serfdom, obligated to work for their lords without pay, unable to leave the manor where they were born, legally bound in a status that was only one step above slavery. After the plague, everything changed. With half the population dead, labor was scarce. Landlords who wanted their fields plowed and their harvests brought in had to compete for workers. Peasants who had been tied to the land could now demand wages, could threaten to leave if conditions weren't improved, could negotiate from a position of strength that would have been unthinkable before the plague. Lords tried to enforce the old arrangements, passed laws freezing wages at pre-plague levels, demanded that peasants fulfill their traditional obligations. But economic reality was stronger than law. Wages rose, conditions improved, and serfdom began its long, slow decline. The plague also changed people's psychology, their sense of how life should be lived. When death could come so suddenly, so randomly, taking the young and healthy as readily as the old and sick, the godly as easily as the sinful, it was hard to maintain faith in the old certainties. Why be good if goodness offered no protection? Why plan for the future when there might be no future? Why save and scrimp and defer pleasure when you might be dead tomorrow? This psychological shift expressed itself in various ways. There was a surge of religious enthusiasm, with people going on pilgrimages, founding chantries to say masses for the dead, joining confraternities devoted to good works. But there was also increased hedonism, a sense that life should be enjoyed while it lasted. And there was a darker current too, a turning against outsiders and scapegoats. In many parts of Europe, Jews were massacred by mobs who believed they had poisoned the wells to cause the plague. England, which had expelled its Jewish population in 1290, directed its anger instead at foreigners in general, at the wealthy who seemed to have survived better than the poor, at anyone who could be blamed for the disaster. The plague returned repeatedly over the following decades, in 1361, 1369, 1375, and at irregular intervals for the next 3 centuries. Each outbreak killed fewer people than the first, partly because survivors of earlier outbreaks had some immunity, partly because the most vulnerable had already died. But the recurrent plagues kept the population low, maintained the labor shortage that empowered workers, and created a sense of living in a world perpetually shadowed by death. Edward III's later years were marked by both triumph and decline. The Treaty of Bretigny in 1360 seemed to confirm English dominance over France, with Edward gaining control of Aquitaine and other French territories in full sovereignty, no longer held as fiefs from the French king. But maintaining these gains proved impossible. The French, under the shrewd leadership of King Charles V and his constable Bertrand du Guesclin, avoided major battles and instead conducted a war of sieges and small engagements, gradually recapturing the territories England had won. The Black Prince, who might have reversed these losses, fell ill with a wasting disease contracted during a campaign in Spain. He returned to England in declining health, increasingly unable to take the field. He died in 1376, a year before his father, leaving his 10-year-old son Richard as heir to the throne. Edward III himself declined into senility in his final years, controlled by his mistress Alice Purse and various courtiers who enriched themselves at the expense of the kingdom. When Edward III died in 1377, his grandson Richard II inherited a troubled realm. The war with France was going badly, the kingdom's finances were strained, and the social tensions created by the plague were approaching a breaking point. Richard was only 10 years old, and a regency council governed in his name, but the real power lay with his uncles, particularly John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, the richest and most powerful nobleman in England. The crisis came in 1381, when the government attempted to collect a poll tax, a flat tax of 1 shilling per person, regardless of wealth or income. This was the third poll tax in 4 years, and it was deeply unpopular, especially among the poor who bore the same burden as the wealthy. When tax collectors arrived in villages demanding payment, they were often met with resistance. In Essex and Kent, this resistance turned into open revolt. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 was not actually led by peasants alone. Many of the rebels were prosperous farmers, craftsmen, and even minor officials. But the core of the uprising came from agricultural workers, people who had seen their wages frozen by law while prices rose, who were legally tied to the land while their lords could move freely, who were told to accept their lowly station while watching others grow rich. The rebels demanded the end of serfdom, the right to sell their labor freely, fair rents, and the punishment of corrupt officials. The revolt spread with startling speed. Rebel bands marched on London from both Kent and Essex, numbering perhaps 50,000 in total. They were led by figures like Wat Tyler, whose name suggests he was a tiler or maker of roof tiles, and John Ball, a radical priest who preached that, when Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? Asking, in other words, what justified the social hierarchy if all humans descended from the same first parents? The rebels entered London, where they were joined by the urban poor. They burned the palace of John of Gaunt, killed officials they regarded as corrupt or oppressive, opened the prisons and freed the inmates, and demanded to meet with the young king. Richard II, now 14 years old, showed remarkable courage by agreeing to meet the rebels at Mile End, outside the city walls. At Mile End, Richard promised to grant the rebels' demands. Serfdom would be abolished, rents would be fair and set at 4 pence per acre, and there would be a general pardon for all who laid down their arms. Many rebels, satisfied with these promises, began to disperse. But others, led by Wat Tyler, were not content. They demanded more radical changes, the disendowment of the church, the execution of corrupt officials, a more equal distribution of wealth. The next day, Richard met with Tyler and his followers at Smithfield. What happened next is disputed. The sources give conflicting accounts colored by their authors' sympathies. But the generally accepted version is that Tyler behaved insolently toward the king, perhaps threatening him, and the Lord Mayor of London, William Walworth, struck Tyler down with his sword. Tyler's followers, seeing their leader fall, prepared to attack, but young Richard rode forward alone and called out, "Sirs, will you shoot your king? I will be your chief and captain, you shall have from me that which you seek." It was an extraordinary moment of royal courage that defused the immediate crisis. The rebels followed Richard to Clerkenwell Fields, where they were surrounded by hastily gathered forces of knights and men-at-arms. Leaderless and outnumbered, they submitted. Richard's promises made at Mile End were revoked. He declared them given under duress and therefore invalid. The leaders of the revolt were hunted down and executed. John Ball was hanged, drawn, and quartered, preaching defiance of the social order to his last breath. The revolt failed, but it had lasting effects. Landlords grew more cautious about pushing their workers too hard, knowing that desperation could lead to violence. The government avoided poll taxes for centuries. And serfdom, though not formally abolished, continued its gradual decline as lords found it easier to rent land to free tenants than to enforce traditional obligations on increasingly resistant serfs. Within a century of the revolt, serfdom had effectively disappeared from most of England, not because of any law or royal decree, but because economic forces and the memory of rebellion made it impractical to maintain. Richard II's personal reign, once he came of age and dismissed his uncle's regency, was marked by his attempts to build a court culture of sophistication and splendor. Richard loved ceremony, beautiful clothes, fine food, poetry, and art. His court became a center of cultural production. It was for Richard's court that Geoffrey Chaucer wrote his Canterbury Tales, that poem that gives us such vivid glimpses into late medieval English society. Richard commissioned the rebuilding of Westminster Hall with its magnificent hammer-beam roof, a wonder of medieval carpentry that still stands today. But Richard was also paranoid, vindictive, and increasingly tyrannical. He never forgot how the Lords Appellant, a group of powerful nobles led by his uncle Thomas of Woodstock, had seized control of his government in 1387 and 1388, executing many of his favorites and forcing Richard to submit to their authority. For 10 years Richard bided his time, rebuilding his power, gathering loyal supporters, waiting for his chance to strike back. In 1397, Richard moved against the former appellants. Thomas of Woodstock was arrested and died in custody, murdered, almost certainly on Richard's orders. The Earl of Arundel was tried and executed. The Earl of Warwick was exiled. Richard began building a personal bodyguard of Cheshire archers, men who wore his badge and were loyal to him personally rather than to the realm. He demanded loans from wealthy subjects that were really forced gifts, knowing they would never be repaid. He began to rule by decree, bypassing Parliament, creating a climate of fear where no one knew who might be the next victim of royal wrath. In 1399, Richard made a fatal mistake. He extended the exile of Henry Bolingbroke, son of John of Gaunt, to life, and when Gaunt died, Richard seized the vast Lancastrian estates rather than allowing Henry to inherit them. This was not just personal tyranny but an attack on the fundamental principle that property should pass by inheritance, not by royal whim. If the king could confiscate the Lancastrian lands, no noble's inheritance was safe. When Richard went to campaign in Ireland, Henry Bolingbroke invaded England to reclaim his inheritance. He claimed to want only what was rightfully his, but he found that virtually the entire kingdom supported him against the king. Nobles flocked to his banner, towns opened their gates, common people cheered him as he marched south. Richard returned from Ireland to find his support melted away, his army disbanded, his cause hopeless. Richard was captured, forced to abdicate, and imprisoned in Pontefract Castle. In February 1400, it was announced that he had died, supposedly from voluntary starvation, refusing to eat in his despair at his fall from power. But as with Edward II, darker rumors circulated that he had been murdered, that Henry, who now ruled as Henry IV, had ordered his predecessor's death to eliminate any possibility of a restoration movement. Henry IV's reign from 1399 to 1413 was troubled from the start. He was the first king since the Norman conquest who was not a direct descendant of William the Conqueror in the male line. He had claimed the throne partly by conquest, partly by descent from Henry III through his mother, and partly by parliamentary recognition. But the legitimacy of his title was questionable, and he faced rebellions throughout his reign from those who questioned his right to rule. The most serious challenges came from the Welsh and from the powerful Percy family of Northumberland. In Wales, Owain Glyndwr, a Welsh nobleman who had been pushed into rebellion by a land dispute, declared himself Prince of Wales and led a Welsh revolt that engulfed the entire principality. Glyndwr proved to be a gifted military leader and a charismatic figure who inspired Welsh nationalism. For several years, he controlled most of Wales, held parliaments, made alliances with France and Scotland, and seemed on the verge of establishing an independent Welsh state. The Percys, who had helped Henry gain the throne, turned against him in 1403, feeling inadequately rewarded for their support and resentful of royal interference in northern affairs. At the Battle of Shrewsbury, Henry and his son, the future Henry V, defeated the rebels. Harry Hotspur, the most famous of the Percys, was killed in the fighting, and the rebel cause collapsed. But sporadic rebellions continued, with the Percys rising again in 1408 before being finally crushed. Henry IV also faced financial problems. The war with France had resumed, campaigns in Wales were expensive, and rebellions drained the treasury. Henry had to call Parliament frequently to request taxes, and Parliament used these opportunities to demand reforms, oversight of royal spending, and redress of grievances. The relationship between Crown and Parliament became more contentious, with Parliament asserting rights that previous kings would not have tolerated but that Henry, ruling under a cloud of dubious legitimacy, had to accept. The king's health broke down in his later years. He suffered from a disfiguring skin disease, possibly leprosy, possibly something else, that left him increasingly unable to govern. His son, the Prince of Wales, gradually took over the reins of government, and when Henry died in 1413, the transfer of power to Henry V was smooth and uncontested. Henry V, who ruled from 1413 to 1422, would become one of England's most celebrated kings, the hero of Agincourt, the conqueror who came closer than anyone since William the Conqueror to uniting the crowns of England and France. Henry was pious, just, an inspiring military leader, and possessed of a single-minded determination to revive English claims to the French throne and make them a reality. When Henry took power, France was weakened by civil war between two factions, the Armagnacs, who supported the crown, and the Burgundians, who controlled much of eastern France and who were increasingly independent of royal authority. Henry saw an opportunity. In 1415, he invaded France with an army of perhaps 10,000 men, besieged and captured Harfleur, and then marched north toward Calais. The French gathered a much larger army, perhaps 50,000 men, and intercepted Henry at Agincourt. On the morning of October 25, 1415, the English found themselves facing overwhelming numbers, tired from their long march, many suffering from dysentery, outnumbered perhaps 5 to 1. It seemed impossible that they could win. But Henry positioned his forces well, on a narrow front where the French could not use their numerical superiority effectively. And when the French knights charged, they found themselves funneled into the killing ground where English archers waited. The longbowmen, those yeoman farmers who trained with their bows from childhood, who could shoot 12 arrows per minute and hit a target at 200 yards, unleashed storm after storm of arrows on the packed French ranks. The French cavalry charges foundered in muddy ground churned up by thousands of hoofs. Knights fell from their horses, weighed down by armor, unable to rise, suffocated in the mud or trampled by their own side. Those who reached the English line found themselves facing not just archers but men-at-arms and even archers wielding mallets and swords, fighting with the desperation of men who knew they had no escape. The battle turned into a slaughter. Thousands of French nobles died, including many of the greatest names in France. English losses were minimal. Agincourt was a stunning victory, but it did not immediately win the war. Henry had to return to England to gather reinforcements and money. He came back to France in 1417, and this time he conducted a methodical campaign, capturing Normandy town by town, fortress by fortress, consolidating his gains rather than marching through France in destructive raids. It took years, but gradually Henry built a secure territorial base in northern France. In 1420, the French were forced to accept the Treaty of Troyes, which recognized Henry as heir to the French throne and regent of France during the lifetime of the Mad King Charles VI. Henry married Catherine, Charles VI's daughter, uniting the royal houses. It seemed that Henry had achieved what English kings had dreamed of for centuries, the union of the English and French crowns. But in 1422, while campaigning in France, Henry V died suddenly, probably from dysentery. He was only 35 years old, at the height of his power, with his great ambition seemingly within reach. He left an infant son, Henry VI, just 9 months old, inheriting 2 kingdoms but too young to rule either. The dual monarchy that Henry V had created would depend on capable regents to maintain, and it would face a resurgent France inspired by a peasant girl who claimed to hear the voices of saints. The reign of Henry VI, from 1422 to 1461 and again from 1470 to 1471, was one of the longest and most disastrous in English history. Henry was pious to the point of simple-mindedness, completely lacking in the political skill and military leadership that his father had possessed. He founded Eton College and King's College, Cambridge, both magnificent educational institutions that survive today. But he was temperamentally unsuited to be a medieval king, especially a king ruling 2 realms that were still at war. The English position in France gradually deteriorated despite the best efforts of capable commanders like John, Duke of Bedford, who served as regent. The French found a symbol and an inspiration in Joan of Arc, a peasant girl from Lorraine who claimed that saints had commanded her to drive the English from France and see the Dauphin crowned as rightful king. Joan's military career lasted only about a year, from 1429 to 1430, before she was captured by the Burgundians and sold to the English, who burned her as a heretic. But she had broken the spell of English invincibility, had inspired the French to believe that God was on their side, and had changed the psychological balance of the war. By 1453, the English had lost everything in France except Calais. The 100 Years' War, which had brought England such glory under Edward III and Henry V, ended in complete defeat. The great lords who had enriched themselves through French campaigns, the soldiers who had known nothing but war in France, the administrators who had governed English territories there, all came home to an England that had no place for them, no use for their skills, and no patience for their complaints. Henry VI's own health, never robust, collapsed completely in 1453. He fell into a catatonic state, unable to speak or recognize anyone, effectively mad. England needed a regent, and the obvious candidate was Richard, Duke of York, who was not only the wealthiest and most powerful nobleman but also had a claim to the throne arguably better than Henry's own. His descent from Edward III through both his father and mother gave him a stronger hereditary right than the Lancastrian line, which descended from Edward III's 4th son. York became protector during Henry's madness, but when the king recovered in 1455, York found himself pushed out of power by the Queen, Margaret of Anjou, and her supporters. Tensions escalated until they exploded into violence at the First Battle of St. Albans in 1455, where York and his allies defeated the royal forces and captured the king. It was the opening battle of the Wars of the Roses, that long series of dynastic conflicts between the House of Lancaster, descendants of John of Gaunt, and the House of York, descendants of Edward III through other sons. The wars that followed were not continuous fighting but rather intermittent bursts of violence separated by uneasy truces. Unlike the wars with France or Scotland, which were fought largely on foreign soil or in border regions, the Wars of the Roses brought fighting into the heart of England. Armies marched back and forth across the country, great battles were fought at Towton, Barnet, Tewkesbury, and other places whose names became synonymous with slaughter. Noble families were divided, with brothers sometimes fighting on opposite sides, sons rebelling against fathers, alliances shifting with bewildering speed. The death toll among the nobility was catastrophic. A disproportionate number of England's aristocratic families lost members, executed after battles, adient and dispossessed, killed in the fighting. The Wars of the Roses destroyed the old Plantagenet nobility almost completely, eliminating entire branches of families that had dominated English politics for centuries. In their place would rise new families, men who proved their loyalty to the winning side and were rewarded with the lands and titles of the defeated. Richard of York died at the Battle of Wakefield in 1460, but his son Edward took up his cause. In 1461, after a stunning victory at the Battle of Towton, fought in a snowstorm, with casualties perhaps exceeding 20,000, Edward was crowned as Edward IV, the first Yorkist king. Henry VI fled into exile in Scotland, then was captured and imprisoned in the Tower of London. The Lancastrian cause seemed finished. But Edward IV made enemies as easily as he made conquests. His secret marriage to Elizabeth Woodville, a widow of merely gentry status, offended Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, the kingmaker who had done so much to put Edward on the throne and who had expected to arrange a politically advantageous marriage for the young king. The elevation of the Queen's numerous relatives to positions of wealth and power alienated established nobles who saw their own influence diminished. In 1470, Warwick switched sides, freed Henry VI from the Tower, restored him to the throne, and drove Edward IV into exile. But Edward returned the following year with Burgundian support, defeated and killed Warwick at the Battle of Barnet, destroyed the last Lancastrian army at Tewkesbury, and reclaimed his throne. Henry VI died in the Tower shortly after Edward's return, officially from melancholy, but almost certainly murdered. Edward's brother George, Duke of Clarence, who had betrayed Edward to join Warwick and then betrayed Warwick to return to Edward, was later executed for treason, allegedly drowned in a butt of Malmsey wine. Edward IV's second reign from 1471 to 1483 was relatively peaceful and prosperous. The king focused on restoring order, promoting trade, and enriching the crown through careful financial management. He avoided expensive foreign wars, cultivated relationships with Burgundy and other continental powers, and allowed England to recover from decades of civil conflict. When he died in 1483, at only 40 years old, apparently from the effects of self-indulgent living, he left his kingdom at peace and his 12-year-old son Edward V as his heir. But Edward V's reign lasted only 2 months. His uncle Richard, Duke of Gloucester, who had been appointed protector during the boy's minority, moved swiftly to seize power. Edward V and his younger brother Richard, Duke of York, were placed in the Tower of London, supposedly for their protection. Richard of Gloucester declared his brother's marriage invalid and their children illegitimate, claimed the throne for himself as Richard III, and was crowned in July 1483. The 2 boys in the Tower, who would become known as the Princes in the Tower, were never seen again. They almost certainly were murdered, though whether Richard ordered their deaths or they were killed by overzealous supporters without explicit orders remains uncertain. Richard's brief reign from 1483 to 1485 was dominated by efforts to establish legitimacy, to win acceptance from a population that suspected him of murdering his nephews, and to defend his crown against challenges from Lancastrian exiles. The challenge came in August 1485, when Henry Tudor, a Welsh nobleman with a weak claim to the throne through his mother's Lancastrian descent, invaded England with French support. He landed in Wales, gathered supporters as he marched east, and met Richard's forces at Bosworth Field on August 22. The Battle of Bosworth was as much political as military. Several of Richard's key supporters, including the powerful Stanley family, were secretly in contact with Henry and were waiting to see which side would win before committing their forces. When the battle reached its crisis, with Richard leading a desperate charge toward Henry's position, hoping to end the battle by killing his rival, the Stanleys intervened on Henry's side. Richard was surrounded, pulled from his horse, and killed. According to legend, his crown was found in a hawthorn bush and placed on Henry's head on the battlefield. Henry VII's victory at Bosworth marked the end of the Wars of the Roses and the beginning of the Tudor dynasty that would rule England until 1603. Henry married Elizabeth of York, Edward IV's daughter, uniting the Lancastrian and Yorkist lines. He systematically eliminated potential rivals, executed or imprisoned those with claims to the throne, and built a new nobility loyal to the Tudor dynasty rather than to the old Plantagenet factions. Henry VII was not a warrior king like Henry V or Edward III. He was cautious, financially shrewd, suspicious of others' motives, more interested in building royal power through careful administration than through military glory. He avoided expensive wars, promoted trade and economic development, filled the royal treasury, and created a governmental system that concentrated power in royal hands. He was, in many ways, a transitional figure, looking back to the medieval past but also forward to the centralized monarchy that would characterize early modern England. By the time Henry VII died in 1509, England had been transformed. The feudal nobility that had dominated the medieval period was broken, replaced by a service nobility dependent on royal favor. The church, which had been semi-independent throughout the medieval period, was beginning to come under greater royal control. Parliament, which had gained significant power during the 14th and 15th centuries, was becoming an instrument of royal policy rather than a check on royal power. The economy was growing, with England's wool trade creating wealth that would finance future expansion. And the world beyond England was changing too. In 1492, Columbus had reached the Americas, opening up possibilities for exploration and colonization that would transform European civilization. In 1454, Constantinople had fallen to the Ottoman Turks, ending the Byzantine Empire and shifting trade routes. The printing press, invented around 1440, was beginning to spread literacy and new ideas. The Renaissance was flourishing in Italy, bringing new approaches to art, literature, and learning that would gradually spread northward. Medieval England, the England of castles and knights, of feudal obligations and chivalric ideals, of a church-dominated culture and an agricultural economy, was giving way to something new. The Tudor period would see the English Reformation, the dissolution of the monasteries, the beginnings of English naval power, the flowering of Renaissance culture in England, and the first tentative steps toward overseas empire. But those are stories that belong to the early modern period rather than to the medieval one. As we come to the end of our journey through medieval English history, from the departure of the Romans to the accession of the Tudors, from the age of Arthur, if he existed, to the age of Henry VII, we can reflect on the extraordinary transformation that occurred over these 11 centuries. The small, divided, partially civilized Britain that the Romans left behind became a unified kingdom with sophisticated legal and governmental institutions, a rich literary and artistic culture, and an emerging sense of national identity. The transformation was not smooth or inevitable. It came through conquest and resistance, through the blending of different peoples and cultures, Romano-British, Saxon, Viking, Norman, into something distinctly English. It came through centuries of warfare, both internal and external, through the slow development of legal and political institutions, through the creativity of countless individuals whose names we know and countless more whose names are lost but whose contributions shaped the emerging nation. Medieval England gave us trial by jury, common law, parliament, universities, Gothic cathedrals, the English language itself in something approaching its modern form. It gave us stories and legends, Arthur and his knights, Robin Hood, the Canterbury Pilgrims, that continue to capture imagination centuries later. It gave us patterns of thought and social organization that, though often transformed beyond recognition, still influence how we think about law, governance, and society. But medieval England was also a place of tremendous suffering and injustice. It was a world where most people lived in poverty, where disease and early death were constant companions, where violence was common and life was cheap. It was a world of rigid social hierarchies where birth determined destiny, where women had few rights, where those on the margins of society, Jews before their expulsion, heretics, the disabled, the poor, faced discrimination and persecution. It was a world where religious certainty often led to intolerance, where the church could be as oppressive as any secular lord, where superstition and ignorance were widespread even among the educated. We should neither romanticize medieval England nor dismiss it as simply a dark age of ignorance and barbarism. It was a complex period that produced both magnificent achievements and terrible atrocities, both sublime art and brutal violence, both sophisticated thought and profound superstition. It was, in short, a time when human beings, with all their capacities for both good and evil, were working out how to live together in organized societies, how to create meaning and beauty in a difficult world, how to build something that would endure beyond their own brief lives. The castles still stand, at least in ruins, reminding us of the military might that was necessary to maintain order in a violent age. The cathedrals still soar skyward, testaments to the faith and the artistic vision of their builders. The common law still operates, evolved but recognizable, connecting us to the judges of Edward I's reign who first systematized it. The English language still carries within it the traces of all the peoples who contributed to medieval England, Latin from the Romans, Old English from the Saxons, Norse from the Vikings, French from the Normans. And the stories still resonate. We still tell tales of King Arthur and his Round Table, even though we know they're largely legendary. We still admire Richard the Lionheart for his courage, even though his reign was actually disastrous for England. We still remember the Black Prince, the barons who forced King John to accept Magna Carta, the longbowmen at Agincourt. These stories, whether historically accurate in detail or not, capture truths about courage and honor, about justice and tyranny, about the human struggle for dignity and freedom that transcend their particular medieval context. As we let these stories settle into our consciousness like dust settling after a long journey, as we allow the images of medieval England to fade back into the gentle mist from which we called them, we might reflect on what connects that distant past to our present. The people of medieval England were not so different from us. They loved their children, mourned their dead, laughed at jokes, fell in love, worked hard, tried to make sense of a confusing world, hoped for better futures for themselves and their descendants. They lived in circumstances dramatically different from ours, with different technologies, different beliefs, different social structures. But the fundamental human experiences, love and loss, hope and fear, joy and sorrow, were the same then as now. When we read about a mother mourning her child who died in the Black Death, we feel a connection across 7 centuries because that grief is something we can understand. When we hear about the villagers who stood up to their lords during the peasants' revolt, demanding dignity and fair treatment, we recognize the same longing for justice that still moves people today. History is not just about understanding the past for its own sake, valuable though that is. It's about understanding the long arc of human experience, seeing how the world we inhabit came to be, recognizing patterns that recur across time, learning from both the triumphs and mistakes of those who came before us. Medieval England is part of our collect. And so we come to rest, here at the end of our journey through the medieval centuries, with gratitude for the opportunity to walk these ancient paths, to meet these long-dead people, to witness these world-changing events. The kings and queens, the nobles and peasants, the saints and sinners who populated medieval England have all returned to dust. Their voices are silent, their struggles are over, their passions have cooled. But through the stories that survive, through the buildings they left behind, through the institutions they created and the culture they shaped, they are not entirely gone. They live on in the inheritance they left us, in the echoes that still reach us across the centuries. Let us leave them now in peace, those medieval English men and women, and let us return to our own time carrying with us the memories of their world. Let us remember the Roman legions marching south to their ships, leaving Britain to its own devices. Let us remember the Saxon ships arriving on the shore, beginning centuries of settlement and transformation. Let us remember the Vikings in their longships, the Normans at Hastings, the Plantagenet kings building their empire and watching it crumble, the peasants rising in revolt, the nobles fighting their wars of succession, the reformers and saints and scholars who shaped medieval culture. And let us remember, as we drift towards sleep or simply sit in peaceful contemplation, that we are part of the same long story. The medieval period ended 5 centuries ago, but its influence shapes us still. We are the inheritors of everything those centuries produced, the good and the bad, the beautiful and the ugly, the wisdom and the folly. Understanding that inheritance, appreciating where we came from, recognizing the long journey that brought us to where we are now, this is the gift that history offers us, if we are willing to accept it. So rest now, gentle listener, with these medieval centuries safe in your memory, These stories tucked away in your mind to revisit whenever you wish. The past is always there, patient and unchanging, waiting for us to return and learn from it again. And England's medieval story, in all its complexity and contradiction, in all its triumph and tragedy, remains one of the most compelling chapters in the human story, a reminder of what we can achieve and what we must guard against, of how far we have come and how much we still carry from those distant centuries. Sleep well, and may your dreams carry you gently through castles and cathedrals, through forests and fields, through the rich tapestry of medieval England, until you wake refreshed and grateful for the opportunity to have wandered, if only in imagination, through those fascinating, terrible, beautiful medieval centuries that shaped so much of the world we know today. Good night, and thank you for joining me on this long, peaceful journey through time.